on a day of rough seas as if announcing a storm. The protagonist of this story, Rose, was standing facing a man. She then asks if the young man wants the truth and if he can trust what she has to say. He replies that it simply doesn't matter. This answer was unexpected for the girl. What exactly did he mean by that? Since Rose knows very well the dangerous word that is trust, the more you trust someone, the more it hurts and makes you resentful when they betray you. Noticing her hesitation, the man insists that she should just say it already. Finally, she decides to tell the truth. Then we go back to the past. In a cabin of a ship, the young man asks if she is a good liar, which the woman clearly denies even though her documents say otherwise. Continuing, he reads some other information from her documents. An articulate and persuasive swindler, extremely intelligent. It is necessary to be careful not to be deceived in a conversation. Rose says she has no idea why they wrote that. After all, she has never told a lie in her entire life. Outside, we see that they are aboard the ship Viheth, which is heading to the island of Monte. The man, listening to this, questions whether in court she had said those exact words. She says yes, but explains that the judge did not listen to her. In any case, she asks him what else was written on that piece of paper. Looking at him with a confident gaze, she comments that even though she is already imprisoned, she feels it was unfair. The young man remained neutral throughout the conversation. Following protocol, he asks her name. She questions the need for that information, since unless he lives in the countryside, there isn't a single soul who doesn't know her name. But in a cold tone, the man states that it is part of the protocol and insists again, asking her name. Rosenwalker, she answers, but the man is bothered by the answer, saying that the name listed in the documents is different. However, Rose insists that she told him her real name, saying that he doesn't care what her real name is, he only needs to confirm the name that is written in the documents. Rosenhauers, she reluctantly replies, uncomfortable to say it aloud. As soon as she sees him writing the name she had just said, it makes her even more irritated, since he ignores her wish not to use that name anymore. The man then continues reading the document out loud. At 17, she was sentenced to 50 years in the women's prison of Perney and escaped a year later. The escape was quite thrilling. She descended a cliff, crossed the mountains on foot, and was arrested 3 months later as a fugitive in São Benesse. Because of that, she received an additional 25-year sentence and was transferred to the maximum security prison Alcapez. She escaped again after 5 years using a spoon to dig a hole and evaded the Imperial Army's pursuit for 1 year. The young man asks her if all that is true, and Rose answers yes, adding that he would probably faint if he found out what she went through to get that spoon. She begins to complain about her stay in Alcapez, but the man cuts her off, saying he is not interested in her useless stories and that she should limit herself to only answering the questions he asks. With no choice, she agrees, but the situation is quite unusual since in front of her is Ian Connor, the famous war hero. It is almost impossible that there exists someone who hasn't seen his face during the war, since during it the planes flew dropping pamphlets with his image, and the moment his voice spread across the skies, everyone looked up as if enchanted. The government knew very well how simple it is to deceive people, and a young tall pilot was a good tool. They used him in the face of the anxiety and despair of the war because everyone needed an Ian Connor at that moment. Our protagonist is pulled out of her daydreams by Connor's voice asking her what crime she committed. Her answer was to question which crime he was referring to. Connor rephrases his question, asking the reason she was being sent to Monte Island, the worst prison on the planet. Rose replies that she escaped from 2 different prisons, so the pride of the Imperial Army was completely destroyed because of her. Connor interrupts her, saying that he is not referring to that. He wants to know the reason why she was arrested the first time. Regarding that, she declares herself innocent. Connor, a little frustrated, reminds her that he is only doing the administrative process and has zero interest in her arguments. But the girl does not intend to back down, and repeats again that she is innocent. So Connor warns her that it is very rare for a prisoner to honestly admit the crime they committed, but insisting on her innocence does not change the fact that she has already been convicted. Rose counters, saying that her conviction also does not change the fact that she is innocent, because the truth is greater than assumptions. Connor repeats for the 3rd time that he has no interest in the girl's arguments. He just wants her to answer sincerely. Rose stares fixedly at Connor, clearly showing confidence in her words. But before she can say anything else, someone abruptly enters the office. One of Connor's subordinates hurriedly enters the room as if he were looking for him, but upon seeing that the commander is accompanied, he questions what his commander was doing, and he responds indifferently that he is just questioning the prisoner. The young man is confused about the reason for doing that, but Connor simply says that it is standard procedure to confirm the prisoner's data, especially someone of her level. Even so, the young man says that although he knows Ian usually is strict with rules, he doesn't need to create more work since the prisoners sent to Monte Island are the worst kind. And this time, one of the prisoners is the infamous Witch of Alcapez. The poor man is startled when he sees who the commander is interviewing and realizes that this witch is right beside him. His argument quickly changes, questioning his commander why he is interviewing someone so dangerous alone. But Connor tells his subordinate that she clearly doesn't look dangerous. His subordinate warns him, even if she looks thin and fragile, he must not lower his guard, because it was precisely that fragile body that escaped from Alcapez prison. Besides, at 17, Rose interrupts the man, continuing his sentence and saying that at 17, she killed her husband, Hinley Howards. She stabbed him 36 times with a kitchen object. The medical examiner confirmed that it was a hate crime. Even after his last breath, the murderer continued stabbing him, with a trembling voice as if recalling that caused her pain. She affirms that it wasn't her who did that, and that she was a good wife who loved her husband. With tears in her eyes, she insists that what happened was someone broke into their house, and that many people were envious of him. So it was only a matter of time until someone came after him. Even so, they didn't even conduct a proper investigation. They simply threw her in prison, ignoring everything she had to say. Connor looks at her with an unshakable gaze while she breaks down in tears. And in a cold tone, he tells her to stop the act, and that the kind of wife she was does not matter. She had been declared guilty of the crime, and he was not there to debate about it. Rose quickly stops crying, frustrated that her acting was ineffective. And since the drama didn't work, she decides to appeal to logic, questioning how someone so weak could kill such a robust man. But Connor counters, saying that no one believed she was capable of escaping from two great prisons either. Still, she did it, and the same logic applies to her husband. Just because she is a small woman of fragile appearance does not mean it is impossible. Besides, all the evidence points to her. The conclusion is simple: the girl is lying, and honestly, he is already tired of this interrogation, so he orders his subordinate Henry to follow him and bring her along. As she was being taken out of the room, she kept repeating that she was not lying and was never guilty. Rose wondered where she was being taken, but honestly, she even thought the young man was much kinder than the other guards she had met. She compares the relationship between guard and prisoner to that of a cat and mouse. The moment the guards lower their guard, she can escape, but the moment she lowers hers, they capture her. But luckily, she is good at taking advantage of small opportunities and managing to escape. This time will be no different. She will also win. Going to the social area of the ship, Ian seems a little surprised that the banquet had already ended. Henry replies that this was intentional to prevent the guests from being exposed to the Witch of Alcapez. Ian finds Henry's concern ironic, since people had chosen to be aboard the Vyheth with the goal of touring the famous prison they were headed to, so seeing the Witch of Alcapez would probably be interesting to them. Henry counters, saying the guests were just civilians, and not everyone there was as brave as him. After the war, the military ships were remodeled into cruise ships. Vyheth was one of them. The steamship, which was once full of gun smoke, gunfire, and wounded soldiers, was quickly replaced by fancy parties and lively music, and the destination of the newest remodeled ship was precisely the island of Monte. Rose cannot help but find it ironic that on the same ship where criminals were taken to a prison famous for being an extremely cruel place, the rich were also transported, considering the terrible prison a tourist attraction. While Rose thinks about this, Henry keeps complaining about her presence bothering the ladies and gentlemen who are forced to put up with her. Connor disagrees, since when they were on the battlefield, they were no different from the prisoners, but his friend reminds him that the two of them fought for the country, while that woman killed her husband. Besides, her escapes consumed a lot of manpower and costs. But after hearing all this scolding, Rose interrupts him, telling him to shut up. Connor, seeing the two arguing, calls Henry's attention, suggesting that he stop wasting energy on useless discussions. Right after, he turns and apologizes to Rose for the disrespect, but Henry kept saying that they were not dealing with just any prisoner, but with a witch. The three continued walking through the corridors until finally reaching the deck, where the moon shone brighter, and Connor comments that he would like to show her something. Rose held firmly onto the railing at her side, finding that landscape the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, a bright moon over the waves of the sea. Never in her life had she seen a scene like this. Rose thought to herself that if she were to become a prisoner, she should at least be one of the famous ones, for someone who had accepted this life. She never expected to be able to see something like that. Connor interrupts her moment of contemplation, commenting that he heard she escaped from Alcapez prison by digging a tunnel, and the girl confirms the story. Then he questions whether she really descended the cliff using her own body, making Rose ask what answer exactly he is expecting. And the commander replies that some people say she used magic to escape. What he wants to know is if that is true. The reason for this question is because 36 years ago, the only person capable of escaping Alcapez was a witch. So when Rose escaped, everyone became convinced that she was one too. Originally, people are afraid of what they do not understand, and nowadays magic is persecuted and science is praised. However, traces of that time still remain, and the few witches that exist hide, but that does not mean they disappeared. Rose, knowing all this, asks Connor if he really thinks she would be imprisoned if she were a witch. If by chance that rumor were real, her hands would not be cuffed like this, and it would make no sense to be on a boat together with all these tourists. Henry interrupts her and tells his commander not to believe those words, because her specialty is precisely lying. But Rose, looking into his eyes, replies that the young man should be the first person to believe her words, because if she really were a witch, she would have shut him up a long time ago. However, if he does not trust her words, maybe he would believe in the magic test she passed. And if all that evidence is not enough, it is probably because his faith in the Empire has already collapsed long ago, and he believes they are incapable of conducting a simple test properly. The soldier fills with rage, but before he can say anything, Connor interrupts him, ordering him to take his hands off the prisoner and saying that if he loses his head one more time, he will be forced to report him to his superiors. That was enough to make the young man step back, not expecting to be reprimanded, and right after receiving orders to fetch what had already been requested. Meanwhile, Connor continues his conversation with Rose and claims not to care whether she is lying or whether she is in fact a witch. He is only going to inform her of a few facts. First, she is a convicted criminal, sentenced to imprisonment on Monty Island. Second, he was ordered to transfer her there, personally. Third, prisoners may have escaped from Alcapez in the past, but no one has ever escaped from Monty Island. That is impossible even for a witch. Rose finally understands that this man is trying to break her spirit. If she wants to escape, she needs to focus on getting the keys to the boat and the handcuffs, because she must flee before reaching the island. Henry interrupts the conversation, returning with what his commander asked for. The girl is curious to see what it is, until she finally manages to take a good look. A tray full of meat, still covered with blood. She does not understand how that would be useful, and she wonders what he intends to do. Connor quickly answers her doubt by pouring the meat over the cold waters, asking her to watch closely what that ocean is capable of doing. The reaction is almost instant. As soon as the first drops of blood fall into the water, something begins to make the waves bubble, frightening Rose, and an indistinguishable creature attacks the meat, devouring it. Henry, with a satisfied smile, asks her to watch the scene carefully, because that ocean is covered with creatures. There is not a single safe place where she can run. Despair immediately strikes the girl, making her think she needs to find a solution for that quickly. Connor takes advantage of her shock and approaches, taking the key ring from his waist, while saying that if she wants to become a snack for those monsters, maybe taking the boat would be the best option. Besides, he had already noticed what on his waist was drawing so much of the girl's attention, holding the key ring in front of her. That man was not a gentleman, and while telling her to change her mind immediately, he revealed the true nature of a guard. Rose had already learned this before, that guards cannot be gentlemen. Connor was different from the man who appeared in the pamphlets. To normal people, he might be a hero, but not to her, because he was just a little rat. Back in her dimly lit cell, she wondered if there was no other way to escape, when another prisoner approached her, asking if she really wasn't going to tell her. Rose asks what she is talking about, and the woman claims she is referring to Ian Connor, since she was back in the room after meeting him. The prisoner wanted to know what he had said, but Rose only summed it up, saying that he was just showing her her true chances of escaping. That was a bit disappointing for her cellmate, so the girl asks what exactly she wanted to hear, and she replies that she expected something more exciting. By chance, she wasn't the only one waiting to hear something. Rose asks Maria, her cellmate, what kind of more exciting thing she was expecting exactly. Her friend immediately starts to develop her fic, the tale of a young and beautiful prisoner who entered the room of the young and handsome commander. But that is as far as her imagination can go, and she asks her to tell her the details already. But Rose is more interested in knowing how her friend could call her a beautiful prisoner in the state she was in. Maria says that among all the women there, she is the youngest. And anyway, she just wanted to know if really nothing happened. But Rose cannot imagine a reason for someone like Connor to want to flirt with her. Maria retorts, saying that strategy had already worked in Alcapez. Rose's smile immediately fades, remembering what she had to do to escape. But this time it is different, because Connor is not the last problem. There are several monsters in the ocean outside, and passing through it would be an almost impossible task. Even so, Maria puts her hand on her shoulder and asks her, was she really thinking of giving up? The relationship between the two of them is interesting to tell. Maria of Alcapez is someone who deserved the nickname of witch more than Rose. If outside the prison the guards are the law, who commanded the prison from inside was Maria, the people who caught her attention died in prison without even serving their sentences. When she was transferred to Alcapez, Rose was already a famous prisoner who had successfully escaped. They met while Rose was digging her way out. Maria asked her if by chance she was trying to wake up all the guards with that noise. Rose cannot say whether she approached her because of her fame when she asked how she got that spoon, but after she caught her attention, her life inside became much more peaceful than before, since the prisoners treated her as one of the leaders. Although she didn't understand the reason at the time, she can understand it now. Maria again asked her if she intended to give up, keeping her eyes full of desperate hope on her. It turns out the prisoners wanted her success, as if they wished to see her destroying the pride of the Imperial Army and covering her tracks, hoping that she would live a comfortable life somewhere, humiliating the Imperial Army. Taking Maria's hand, Rose says that apparently no one there knows her, because she never gives up, especially now that her escape has become a symbol of resistance for all of them. Her friend raised a huge smile upon hearing that, saying that was what she was waiting to hear. Then she threw a cigarette into her hand. The girl was in shock, seeing that her friend had not only managed to get one, but even had matches to light it. But putting that aside, she began to debate with Maria about Ian Connor, asking if he wasn't just a pilot, even gaining fame during the war. It is valid to wonder what he is doing there, since that is not a place for air forces. But that was something Maria also wanted to know. And she raises the hypothesis that he was transferred for being sick, but to Rose he seemed completely healthy. What kind of illness would take down that human being molded to be the very definition of perfection? But Maria says her friend did not understand what she meant, and simply brings her index finger to her head, implying that Connor had gone mad. To Rose, that seemed even more absurd. How had that perfect man gone insane? But her friend did not care, and it did not matter. It was not something that affected them. What mattered was how they were going to seduce him. Rose replies that this kind of thing only works with complete idiots. Honestly, she does not know what to do now. For example, let's suppose she manages to steal the key. Would it be possible after that, using a lifeboat without an engine to cross the ocean full of monsters? Obviously, that is impossible. The problem she is facing is not just escaping, because even if she survived, she would surely die of hunger adrift. But honestly, she does not think there is another way. Except the boat. However, she needs to think of a way to make it work. However, her reasoning is interrupted by the sound of something bouncing. Complaining to the person responsible to stop it because it was distracting her, she notices that the author of that sound was a little girl who had come out of absolutely nowhere. Rose immediately became determined to find out how that girl had gotten down there, and Maria just says she doesn't know, but it was precisely that little girl who had brought her the cigarette. Rose, still shocked at her friend's brazenness, tells the little girl that it is not a good idea to go there alone, and asks where her parents are. The girl turns around, and when she sees the woman, her eyes shine, and she immediately runs in her direction. Rose becomes even more irritated because she had told her clearly to go away and not to get closer. When finally standing in front of her, the child gives a smiling hello and introduces herself as Lila Leeville. Immediately, Rose recognizes that surname and asks the little girl if she knows Henry, and Lila replies that he is her uncle, asking if by chance the prisoner was his friend, and Rose replies that you could say so. But if before she already could not stand that idiot's filthy mouth, seeing his carelessness with his own niece, letting her end up in a prison makes her even more irritated. Quickly, she scolds the girl, saying she should know very well that this is not a place to walk around, not being any children's playground, which makes the poor little girl sad. The little girl explains that she just wanted to brag to her friends that she met Rose and Walker. Rose herself smiles when hearing the girl say that with such excitement. Lila explains that there were rumors that the witch was on the ship, and since her grandfather was the captain, she had told everyone that she would meet her, but none of her friends believed it. Rose smiles at hearing this revelation and congratulates the little girl for getting what she wanted, because she was Rose Walken. Meanwhile, on the deck, Henry lets out a sneeze, feeling that someone was talking about him, and comments that he had received a troublesome task with his commander, referring to Rose. Connor tells his subordinate that he should think of it as a kind of break, because they could admire the view of Monty Island on the way back, something people pay a fortune to see. Henry just finds that place monotonous and asks if his friend is not bored after the war ended, because in his opinion, a prison island over a sea of monsters is no amusement park. But Connor just laughs, calling him old, and asks if he is bothered by that woman, referring to the witch of Alcapez, and Henry replies that yes, because she is from Riorton. Henry tells his commander not to worry so much, but soon repeats the name of the city, before saying that now everything is fine. But he comments precisely on the fact that Rose is also from there, and apparently committed crimes while living in the surroundings. Connor says he already knew that, and his friend was already aware of that fact, especially because he wrote everything on a piece of paper. That's exactly why he commented about her. His theory is that precisely for this reason, he cares so much about the girl, even carrying out a separate interrogation, without a plausible reason. Riorton was the hometown of both of them, where they spent their childhood going to the military academy, and at the same time, it is the place where he piloted a plane for the first time. It is also the name of the city that was devastated by an explosion. The truth is that Rose is an extremely lucky girl, because she escaped death by fleeing the city, a prisoner sentenced to life imprisonment who used that to escape death. In a way, she is going to Monty Island practically like a celebrity, in addition to being escorted by the hero Connor. Connor understands his friend's point, but states that it is still Monty Island, and asks if he knows the meaning of that, reminding him of past traumas. The young man replies that he knows very well, but still does not feel any more confident. Immediately, this makes him remember his past in Rearton, where he held a baby in his arms while seeing the body of a dead woman, and to this day, he cannot accept her death. Whether it is Monty Island or any stupid name, the truth is that the Witch of Alcapez is still alive. The little girl who was still among the ship's cells was shocked to know that the woman she was talking to was the real Rose Walker. The prisoner, taking the opportunity to play a little with the girl, asks her to keep it a secret because it is not something she tells just anyone. Lila asks if what they say in the newspaper is really true, that she dug a tunnel with a spoon, which the prisoner admits. The little girl then asks if she really is a witch capable of using magic. Rose's smile fades almost instantly, and one last time she confirms the girl's name, who answers with a smile on her face. The prisoner says that she has something important to ask, catching her attention, but undoing her smile before saying that if she is capable of doing that, she would show her magic. Leela hesitates because her grandfather had told her never to grant the wishes of prisoners. But Rose asks if she doesn't want to see her magic, and immediately Maria understands what is happening there. In any case, the false witch claims it is not difficult at all to answer, and she is only curious. In the end, the girl ends up accepting, giving Rose the reason she needed to celebrate before asking if the little girl knew Ian Connor. Something obvious, since he was her uncle's boss and a war hero. Then she asked if the two were close, to which Lila replied no, because he was very slow. But her uncle always says that even if he does not express it, he likes her a lot since he has known her since she was in her mother's womb. Her other uncle also said that he is a good man, but she is not sure about that. Rose asks if Connor is married, but the girl replies that he is not, and the adults had even told him to marry earlier, but he is not interested. But that was not exactly what the woman wanted to know, realizing that it would be difficult to keep the conversation innocent. The prisoner tries to be more direct and asks if Lila saw any girl entering his room, or just keeping him company, being answered that no, and noticing that the conversation is becoming more difficult than she imagined. Regaining a bit of her focus, she finally asks if the commander is an affectionate person, but the poor little girl does not know what that word means. And now Rose needs to figure out how to ask a child if Connor is a womanizer, without explaining what that means. Maria steps into the conversation and explains that affectionate means feeling sorry for someone, like giving a house to a dog on a rainy day, or crying along with someone who is crying. The little girl seems to understand and replies that that is not affection, it is love. The answer was a bit too direct, but Rose confirms saying that is exactly what she meant. Meanwhile, her friend laughed in the background, not believing that the famous witch was struggling so much to get 1 or 2 sentences from a child. Lila replies that there does not seem to be anyone Connor loves, which is a little disappointing for Rose, because she hoped to seduce him. But the little girl says that even so, he is a good person because he is known as a hero, which is funny from the point of view of a prisoner inside that ship. But even so, Rose thanks her. It does not matter what someone like her thinks of a hero. So she turns to the girl and says that as promised, she will honor her word. For that, she asks the girl to show her anything she has with her, no matter how small, and receives a coin. Lila asks what the prisoner intends to do with it, but keeping the suspense, Rose replies that magic has its secrets, and that is what makes it so enchanting. Then, while hiding the coin with her, she says that to do magic, it is necessary to transmit your magic into something, then shows that the coin in her hand has disappeared. The little girl is surprised to see that it really worked, thinking that her little coin was gone, but the prisoner says no, putting her hand to her ear. She then takes the hidden coin and gives it back to her, saying it was a lucky coin, and tells her that at sunset, that little coin would turn into gold, but only if she didn't reveal it to anyone, otherwise the magic would disappear. After the girl leaves, Maria asks her friend if she really used magic, and Rose says it was just a simple trick, but she would hardly find that out. Then her cellmate asks if her main argument wasn't precisely the fact that she had never lied. Seeing that people there are already starting to doubt if she really isn't a witch, she asks why she would still be imprisoned if that were true. Besides, even if she escaped, there is only water everywhere. But Maria disagrees with that last point. Even if it were impossible to get a lifeboat, isn't there another possibility they are overlooking besides escaping by boat? Thinking about it, she remembers there is a rumor of witches who escaped and hid from the world, going to the so-called Witch Island, Walpurgis. Maria talks about it and asks if the girl had never heard of it. Then she says that the last time she heard, the place was not far from Monty Island and wonders if they are hiding among the people. But Rose replies that Walpurgis is not a place where anyone can just enter. It is called the Witch Island for a reason, being the last option where someone should flee to. And honestly, she does not believe she would be welcomed with open arms. Maria tells her she was just joking and then begins to think that if that blatant lie worked with the little girl, maybe it will also work with the commander, and asks if it wouldn't be a good idea to at least try. Rose agrees, since that seems to be the only path. Trying to gain the hero's sympathy might seem like a plausible plan, but the trick she used against the idiots she met so far wouldn't work on that man. Besides being a soldier, he is a pilot and a hero, the complete opposite of her. So far, his life has been full of achievements, triumphs, totally the opposite of hers. So to win him over, and that is precisely his weakness. She needs to give him what he wants, humiliate herself, fall at his feet and beg until she becomes his newest conquest. Make him feel the sweet taste of triumph. Tempting him with love will not work. To deceive him, she needs to attack his ego. That is much easier than making him fall in love. Meanwhile, on the deck, after having listened to his friend's outburst, Connor believes that this time he will be fine. However, his reaction is nothing new. He had already discussed this with a friend before, asking for advice, and she told him that even though he needs to vent his frustrations, Henry is incapable of controlling how he does it. Connor asked her what he should do in these situations, and she only answered that in those cases, he should just listen to him, without interrupting. Let him pour everything out. Just listen and not touch the subject too much if possible. Connor decides to follow the advice and does not try to correct his friend. He just tells him that they have been outside for too long, and maybe it is time to go inside, while continuing to listen to him. And while they return to the hall, Henry continues complaining about the situation. He finds it simply ridiculous that a war hero like his friend is being sent to transfer the witch of Alcapez, because an order like that makes no sense at all. And Connor replies that soldiers are only there to obey orders. Henry retorts, saying that by achieving a prestigious position within the army, this should end. After all, after everything he did on the battlefield, at the very least he should be a field marshal. But Connor himself is not sure if that is true, and Henry asks him exactly why he is not sure. Since the only people who do not like him are a few soldiers and the people of Riorton, the truth is that the two know very well the reason he is in this position. The superiors are trying to put the blame on him. The truth is that since he failed to protect Riorton, everyone wants to see him face the witch of the city, and that is the only reason there are so many people there, to see which of the two will survive. If he manages to successfully take the witch to Monty Island, everyone will celebrate and praise, this being his great prize. In the end, it is nothing more than a big show. What they want to see is only the victory of the impeccable Ian Khan, the hero of the entire empire. In any case, when this is over, everyone will simply go back to living their lives, and he will have nothing more than a glorious future ahead of him. Those words, glorious future, echo in Connor's mind. Only when the war ended and he passed through the Arc de Triomphe in his uniform did he finally realize the true meaning of it. When everyone gathered and shouted his name, holding baskets of flowers while throwing colorful petals in his direction. But was he really happy at that moment? Why did he feel breathless? What did his expression say as he passed through the Arc de Triomphe? He should have been smiling, but he asked himself, was I smiling appropriately? No matter how much he thinks, he cannot remember it. Henry knew very well about this feeling his friend carried. No one can protect everyone, so how could there be a perfect victory? Connor was not a god, and everyone knows that a commander may have to make a cruel decision at any moment, but saying this was nothing more than grumbling. Then Henry tells his friend not to worry about the witch, that he will take care of it, but he is interrupted by him, who tells him not to lose his head over it. Before worrying about others, it is better to focus on his recovery, which leaves the blonde irritated, because he already feels much better, but his plea is ignored. All he can do is watch his friend leave as if he did not need him. Later, sitting in his office, Connor reflected, while Henry's voice echoed in his head, saying that it was not his fault the deaths in Riorton. The operations commanded by the Air Corps at that time were crazy gambles. If it weren't for Connor's command, everything would have been a complete failure. But the commander himself did not feel that way. Whose fault would those deaths be if not his? How could it not be his fault? This makes him remember when he received this mission to escort the prisoners to Monty Island, with the addition to keep an eye on Rose Howard's. That last order echoes in his head, his desk already full of news articles and reports about her, the fugitive from Riorton, the only survivor. In a way, he felt guilt. That girl was the only one still alive. This makes him question what he did with Riorton. While thinking distractedly, he ended up letting something important pass, until a female voice interrupted him. Looking ahead, he remembers what he was doing, because Rose, irritated, was asking him why exactly he had called her there, and if he was at least listening to her, or just treating her like a simple piece of furniture. After regaining his focus, Connor returns to what he was doing, showing the prisoner a picture of a shark, and teaching her about the type of creature that lived in those seas as if he were talking to a little child. Irritated with all that nonsense, Rose stands up and slams her hands on the table, ordering him to stop immediately. Summarizing all that nonsense, the girl said that all he was trying to say is that thinking about escaping from there is stupid. That's why he is teaching her about the monsters. Honestly, she doesn't even know how many days have passed since this nonsense started, and asks if he thinks she is an idiot. Connor replies that there isn't much difference between a hero and an idiot, and precisely for that reason, he doesn't distinguish the two. to. In her position, a normal person wouldn't even have the courage to think about escaping. Rose asks if he is calling her impulsive, but Connor says he only called her brave. But it is undeniable that some people see her as a kind of heroine of the darkness. The woman turns to him and asks if, in his opinion, she is this heroine that everyone believes in, or just a lucky idiot. The young man replies that in his standards, she became an idiot the moment she escaped from prison. And upon hearing that, the girl kicks the table, making Connor ask her to hold back her aggressiveness a little. Rose says she only did that because he called her an idiot, but the truth is that the poor man only answered a question. This makes her ask if, to him, she should stay quiet while serving 50 years in prison, and Connor agrees that doing that is also not intelligent. Rose thinks carefully about her next answer because she had already noticed that the commander seems more interested when she says some nonsense. So she asks, what would the intelligent mind of the war hero do in her place? Seeing Connor's heavy sigh, Rose already starts celebrating, thinking she managed to attract his sympathy. But Connor, still writing his notes, says that when she was being judged, she could have had her sentence reduced if she confessed, and if she behaved in prison, she could request parole and even go to a better prison. Rose jokes, saying that if she had done that, she wouldn't have escaped the bombing in Riorton, but Connor doesn't seem to have liked the joke. Then she goes on saying that first of all, she doesn't know why she has to rot in prison for 50 years, being answered that the crime of murder carries a sentence of 8 to 50 years. The woman understands, but states again that she did not kill her husband, and even if she had, she doesn't understand why 50 years, since her neighbor beat his wife to death and only got 8. Connor raises his hand and points behind her, saying that the reason why that happened is written in the books back there. Rose, making a pitiful face, says that even if they were there, she couldn't read them, and Connor knows that very well. But as he just said, her answer is written in the law. The woman tries to argue, but Connor interrupts her, because in the end, her being sentenced to life imprisonment on Monty Island is purely her problem. Then he gets tired of the conversation and decides to leave, even as Rose protests for him to wait. Pulling the girl by the chains, he says that the interrogation is already over, and no matter how much she insists, he does not stop. But Rose knows she cannot leave like that, because if she leaves that room now, she will return to her cell, and in the worst case, she will not have another chance again. This is the only chance she has to say the nonsense she needs to attract his attention. She needs to think quickly about what to say. When the door of the room is about to be opened, Rose asks what the difference is between the two of them. Since in the end he is also an idiot, Connor asks what she is talking about, and the girl reminds him of what he said before, about there not being much difference between an idiot and a hero. In that case, what makes him different from her? Because if she is a heroine of the darkness, then he is a hero of the light, which makes them both idiots. So what exactly would be the difference? In the end, when they are at war, both only think about victory. The two were part of a small country, but one that called itself an empire, and faced Talus, the nation that defeated several other countries. Connor replies that in the end, they won. And Rose agrees, but exactly what did they gain with that victory? Many people died and the country was completely destroyed. As a hero, he only wears a nice uniform, while escorting the humble prisoner. If he is this grand hero that everyone says he is, then what is he doing there now? For the first time, Connor loses his patience, and pulling her closer, orders her to shut her mouth. Rose had achieved what she wanted. She made him step out of character. She asks him if he really thinks that was a victory, irritating him even more. She only needs him to slap her, and she keeps provoking him to do it. Enduring a single moment of pain is nothing. If this helps her to be freed, then he can crush her under his feet. She is already used to using pain as a weapon. And when she thought he would finally hit her, Connor only punches the door, and looking into her eyes tells her she has no right to say that. Countless comrades died and were wounded in the skies of Riorton, and as always, history will not remember them. But everyone knew that, and even so, they gave their young lives to protect the people of the Empire. People like her, who only know how to run away, and are not even capable of appreciating that sacrifice. So, at the very least, she could have the decency not to insult them. And honestly, he hopes she learns this from the opportunity she is having, that not everyone chose to live as she did. Besides, he is sure everything she said was only to provoke and get his attention, so it is a good idea to stop her games and provocations, because her lies are far too shallow to reach him. Rose can't even believe that this man is the same person who is angry just now. She repeats again that she never lied. Connor by this point is already tired of her attempts at manipulation. In the end, the prisoner did not go much further than he expected, but as a small concession, he decides to tell her something. In fact, there is no need for a chain like this in this sea. Even so, the reason why she needs to wear it on her wrist is for the weight of her sin, that of taking a person's life. Hearing those words, Rose thinks that even coming from the same mouth, the two things he told her seem to have been said by completely different people. In the end, she was right. He is also a great idiot. Connor looks into her eyes and says that he knows exactly the type of person she is, and he will not fall for her tricks. So for now, he does not want to hear any more questions. Standing on the other side of the door, Rose asks herself what exactly she was expecting and begins to remember the day of the bombing. His voice echoed throughout the city. "Dear people, rest assured, no one will hurt you anymore. When the air raid alarm sounds, turn off the lights and go to the gates to listen to the broadcast. I am protecting the skies of the Empire." Rose had already lost count of how many times she had heard that voice, and if she was hearing that same voice again, it was because she had completely lost her sense of reality. She was deluding herself into thinking that if she kept talking to him, those same comforting words would come out. By doing this, she was only being an idiot. All of this was simply irritating. She could not imagine that man really being a hero, but it was not worth falling into despair now. There would be another chance for sure. But while she was thinking, someone found her. It was Henry asking her what she was doing there, with his hair tied back and even his face washed. All that was missing was makeup. Rose replies that she just freshened up her look and asks if he likes what he sees, making him stumble, but not admitting anything. Henry asks what exactly she is plotting this time, but the girl only pretends not to understand and says she only washed because she saved a little water. But the young man does not fall for her little act and tells her to stop being dumb. Then the prisoner asks if he has any idea of her plan, and initially he replies yes. But he begins to stumble all over when he has to explain, saying that he knows, but at the same time doesn't know exactly, and this and that in the end. Rose only thinks how lucky she would be if Connor were like that, and she decides to explain to him what happens when a man and a woman are alone in a room, until Henry tells her to shut up. Then, with a sweet look, she asks if he got irritated because he is interested in her. The blonde even starts stuttering while asking what kind of nonsense she is talking about, and Rose continues saying she thought that because he is always staring at her, so clearly he cannot get her out of his head. Realizing the witch is already invading his thoughts, Henry speeds up his pace toward the prison, while Rose says that if he wants a hug, it's fine, because she doesn't hurt. But he only tells her to speed up her steps, and while they walk, the two end up passing by Lila. The little girl was there, eating some chocolates, and Rose was already starting to get a little annoyed because once again they had left her unsupervised walking around the ship, and she began to wonder if the girl would really be alright, until she remembered that, looking more closely, she and her uncle were quite alike, and she takes advantage of this to give him a little scare. Getting closer to the guard, she says with the fakest smile she has that his niece is actually quite cute and asks if her name happens to be Lila, making Henry immediately startled. He asks how the prisoner knows her, and Rose just replies that it wasn't hard to figure out. By reflex, he ends up looking back and dropping his keys on the floor. As soon as she fixes her eyes on the girl, Rose asks if he got scared. But when he looks at his niece, calmly eating sweets, he feels a little calmer. Rose asks why he got so nervous, since she is handcuffed all the time, and the soldier replies that he is still sure she is a witch, even if everyone else keeps denying it, and if by chance she even touches a single hair on his niece's head, she will regret it, but Rose only lets him think whatever he wants. However, while he yells at the prisoner, Rose panics and starts shouting Lila's name, asking what she is doing. The little girl starts having trouble breathing, and when the two look at her, they see her choking on the chocolate. Rose is the first to notice and begins begging for some doctor to help, and asks Henry where the doctor on that ship is, but he doesn't answer, even though his niece is dying, because he is completely paralyzed. Rose wonders why that idiot is acting like that. Seeing that she won't get any help, she starts begging for someone to help the girl, but there isn't a single useful person there. They were in the worst place possible for a child to choke, making her question how she could help. In the midst of desperation, she takes the impulse to run to the little girl, but her hands are cuffed and she can't do anything. Turning again to the soldier, she begs him to wake up quickly, because she knows a way to save her, and she shouts for him to release her now. This makes her remember her past, when she was younger and studying first aid with a woman named Emily, who asked if it was really necessary to know that. Henry unlocked her handcuffs while remembering the woman's reply. Of course you should know. People don't only die in battle. Humans are fragile creatures who die or get hurt for ridiculous reasons. Rose asked why she should pass her knowledge on to other people, since it's not as if they would be grateful for it, but Emily only replied that the world cannot be saved by a single person. And while running toward Lily, the prisoner remembered that although humans are not capable of using magic, there would come a moment in which someone would need her. People ended up waking up at the noise and came out of their rooms to see what had happened. When finally everyone arrived, they saw that there was a little girl choking in the corridor, leaving everyone shocked. One of the guests asked if she was all right, and another answered that, luckily, someone had saved her. In shock, Rose could not believe that she had really done it, and while Lily cried in her arms, she could only think that she had truly saved a child. Henry ran desperately toward his niece, and hugging her, asked if she was all right. The ship's guests were asking what had happened, and a woman who opened the door already at the very end of the commotion said that she hadn't seen much since she had arrived late, but it seemed to her that that woman was holding the child and performing first aid. Apparently, something had gotten stuck in her throat. Everyone was relieved to hear this until they finally realized who had been the girl's savior, yet something else caught Rose's attention. Looking at the floor, she saw that what had been stuck in Lily's throat was just a simple chocolate. The girl almost lost her life because of a simple sweet. Rose could not hold back her laughter. Something as harmless as a little candy is capable of killing someone just like a bullet. Apparently, it's not only soldiers who can save or kill people. In the end, Emily had been right. A little calmer, she wondered if Henry had already come to his senses. Taking advantage of the fact that she had probably gained his sympathy with what she had done, she asked what the blonde thought of her skills. Someone overheard and started approaching her, while the prisoner continued saying that if he was grateful, he could at least give her a little water to wash herself. At the very least, he could bring her some decent food for her cell, but soon she realized the young man wasn't responding, until a different voice answered her, saying that all of that was worth much less than the life of the little girl. It was Connor, who was willing to grant her requests. Rose, looking directly at him, asked what he was doing there, but soon their conversation was interrupted by an older voice asking if Lila was all right. That was the captain of the ship. Seeing the little girl healthy, Rose smiled, and standing up said that she had only been joking when she asked for those things. She wasn't really expecting anything in return for helping the girl, but Connor told her that it wasn't difficult to reward her with the things she had asked for, because the Imperial Army always settles its debts. And even though she was a prisoner sentenced to Monty Island, she would not be an exception. Extending her hands to be handcuffed again, the prisoner asked if they really would let her take a bath, and Connor replied yes. However, she would still need to remain handcuffed, which made her ask how exactly she was supposed to scrub herself, unless they planned to water her down like a vegetable. The man said he would arrange for a servant to help her, so she could feel lucky, for she would be receiving treatment worthy of a princess. But their conversation was interrupted by an old voice asking if he couldn't be a little kinder, and before he could respond, the captain of the ship shouted his name furiously, asking where he had gotten so much lack of manners and how he could treat the savior of that child with such rudeness. Rose immediately realized that old man wasn't joking around, and Connor even tried to argue that he was doing it because of the passengers, but the captain said he had already ordered Henry to accompany everyone to their rooms, so now he could let the young lady go free, even if just for a moment. After all, they were surrounded by the sea anyway. Connor refused, and the old man asked for what reason, saying that here he had no choice. While the two argued over whether what mattered there was imperial law or the captain's orders, Rose watched everything as if from the best seats, enjoying the quarrel. The old captain said that the rules of the land don't work at sea. On that ship, he was the law, and Rose clapped her hands at his firmness. With a slightly kinder tone, the old man asked if an exception couldn't be made, since that was Lila's savior, so he would like at least to have her shackles removed as a gesture of gratitude, since one cannot thank someone while keeping them handcuffed. Connor insisted that he could not do that, for she was still a prisoner. But while looking at his granddaughter, he said that before being a prisoner, on that ship, she is a savior. Connor retorts saying that the woman was already a prisoner before saving the girl, and immediately the old man starts hitting him on the head with his cane, ordering him to be careful with how he speaks to him. The young man insists that he is just a soldier with the duty to follow the orders given by his superiors, and cannot make exceptions for a prisoner, but the captain ignores him and starts speaking directly to Rose. First, he apologizes for the lack of courtesy of that immature young man, and asks her to accept his gratitude. By the way, he had forgotten to introduce himself, and also asks forgiveness for his bad manners. He was already retired, but had been an admiral of the Navy, and although he causes a bit of shame, he believes she has heard of the famous Alex Leavell. Rose even recognizes the name, but the memory seems a bit blurry in her mind, until she finally remembers. He was the statue of the war hero that stood in the square, and the old man is glad to be recognized. It was impossible not to know who he was, since he was an old war hero. Even a street child like her knew that name, and had seen his portraits countless times. That guy was really a big shot, and she simply cannot believe that those three are from the same family. An idiot, a cutie, and a grand war hero. They don't look alike at all. Containing some of her excitement, she says she is not Miss, and her name is not Howard's. Her name is Rose Walker. Alex changes the subject and begins to talk about how Lila is his first and only granddaughter, and if it weren't for her, he probably would have lost her. He apologizes, but he heard when the girl asked to take a bath, and Rose said she would be grateful if they could provide that in her cell, and it would also be great if she had a bit of meat, but Alex said he could not do that with her, leaving her confused. What he meant is that he cannot treat the savior of his granddaughter that way. It is something he would never do as a member of the Leeville family. And somehow, Rose finds that familiar. In the name of his honor, the old man would not allow something so absurd to happen. By the way, taking advantage of having touched on the subject, he asks if she doesn't have plans for the next day. Would she like to join them for dinner? Just imagining the terror it would be to be stuck at a table with a bunch of rich and irritating people already gave her chills, so she ends up refusing. Realizing that the poor girl might be embarrassed, Alex tells her it will not be anything grand, just a simple gathering with his family. But so far he has exaggerated in everything he has said and done, so it is hard to believe. Connor ends up intervening in the situation and carefully tells the captain that that would be too much for Rose, because she is a murderer, a witch, a commoner. That was what the girl thought Connor believed about her, and she already imagined the type of treatment he thought appropriate. Probably what he really meant was weak people, poor people, unlucky people, and people who are avoided. I always wished my Air Forces would keep those people safe. And Rose was right to think that of him, because the next moment, Connor called her a murderer, with all the letters. But the girl would not let that slide, and politely thanks the captain, saying that it would be an honor to join his family for dinner, and since she is always hungry, she could not afford the luxury of refusing, and she could indeed eat, even if handcuffed, if necessary. Connor speaks over her and says he cannot ignore the risk of escape, but Rose only uses his own words, saying that, in any case, she would not be able to escape. After all, Commander Connor had kindly shown her the terrible things that live in the sea. He, in turn, seeing that his own tactic had been used as a weapon against him, is left speechless. Rose, seeing his face, frozen at her response, remembers when she was younger, and her mother complained for having picked up yet another of his pamphlets on the street. The poor thing even tried to invent some excuse, saying she only picked it up by chance since it fell in front of her. But of course, that was not just coincidence. And her mother knew and only asked her to be careful and not let Hindley see it. Rose did not want to admit it, but she had many expectations of him. So every time she confirmed that that idealized man was totally different from what she imagined, she became very irritated, and she wished from the bottom of her heart that he only existed in her imagination. But life always keeps leading her down an unwanted path, and looking at him coldly, she asks if he agrees that there is no way to escape the ship. Already, the next day, in a golden room fully illuminated, a different environment from the cell where she spent her days. Rose woke up lying in a bed, and not on the typical stone floor, wondering where she was. Still drowsy, she wondered why she was there, since that was certainly not her cell, but it was far too comfortable to worry about that, so she decided to just let it go and sleep a little longer. But then someone knocked on her door. Asking permission, a woman entered the room and politely asked if Rose had slept well. The girl was still confused about all of that, and thought about asking who the three women in front of her were, but they went ahead and introduced themselves as Michelle, Louise, and Maya, who were only there to help with the bath. Without even giving her time to react, two of them grabbed her arms and pulled her out of bed. The poor thing tried to resist, asking them to wait, but the maids simply ignored her and started dragging her directly to the bath. Before she realized it, she was already immersed in a bathtub, and the only thing that went through her mind was that she was in heaven. Finally, after going through that initial confusion of someone who had just woken up, she remembered why she was there. The old captain had invited her to dinner as thanks. At first, she thought about refusing, but ended up accepting as a way to provoke Connor. After that, they guided her to a princess's room where she spent the night, and that was what had happened. Honestly, she didn't even remember how long it had been since she had taken a decent bath, and she wondered if those maids had been sent by the captain. While she thought about how she would get out of there, one of the girls asked her out of curiosity if she really was a witch. Rose answered by asking if they really believed that, and the three had already expected that answer, and had only asked her because Lila was bragging to everyone that she had met a witch, and had begged the three of them to keep it a secret. The prisoner understood perfectly. Children usually assume things too quickly, since they are very naive. And after clearing up their doubts, the three maids started pampering Rose again, asking if she wanted a little more hot water, or if they should scrub her back, but were rejected. Even so, they ignored her request to stop and poured just a little more hot water to relieve her fatigue, since the captain had given them very specific instructions to pamper her. Rose wasn't refusing out of politeness or anything like that. It was just that the longer she stayed in that place, the more intensely she would feel the cold wind on her skin when she returned to her routine. She didn't want to get used to that warmth. For her, it was nothing more than unnecessary luxury. When she was younger, she was innocent, but now it was different. She didn't intend to be carried away by all that shine like an idiot. That definitely wouldn't happen again. But while she was thinking, something suddenly interrupted her trance. A commotion was happening outside. There was a male voice joking around, and the poor girl was almost dozing off again. The maids were telling that mysterious voice that he couldn't enter there, and the one making all that fuss was Henry, who insisted on guarding the place, swearing with all his might that he didn't want to be forced to do it, but he needed to make sure. He insisted firmly on at least staying at the bathroom door while waiting for her to finish her bath, since those were the commander's orders. But before that discussion could go on any longer, both he and the maids were caught by surprise. Rose came out of her bath and asked him directly if he had something to say to her. The scene shocked everyone, leaving them petrified on the spot. Quickly, Henry covered his eyes, asking what exactly she was doing. And truly confused, he questioned if she remembered that he was a man, but the girl didn't care. After the initial shock passed, the young man lowered his authoritarian tone a little, specifically with Rose, and asked the maids to excuse them, which obviously frightened them. But he explained that he only needed to deliver confidential information. One of them asked why now, of all times, since he could at least wait for Miss Walker to get dressed. And embarrassed, the poor boy begged them not to misunderstand him, since it was Connor who had given that order. Besides that, the captain had signed off on that decision. The three ended up leaving them alone, and Rose asked what exactly he wanted, and if he was there to search her, since he had sent the three away so suddenly. Henry asked what would even be the point of a search, since she had nowhere to hide anything, and if by chance she thought he was some kind of weirdo. The girl replied bluntly that in the current situation he certainly was. There was no way to disagree with that, but putting that aside, Henry took a step forward, ordering her to stay where she was, since he would just say something and leave, then shut the bathroom door, staying outside. Rose returned to her bathtub, saying that apparently he really didn't know how to lie. And leaning against the wall outside, the young man asked what she was talking about, being answered by the prisoner that it didn't make sense to put a lieutenant as a servant for a simple prisoner taking a bath. There had to be something more to say since he had sought her out, and surely it was something he wanted to keep secret. His superior may have ordered him to guard the bathroom door, but he hadn't told him to go inside. So she wanted to know, without him using his superior's order as an excuse, what exactly he wanted to tell her. And the young man answered that it was about Lila. Rose already began to imagine what the man intended to say, and apologizing without apologizing, she called him useless, which Henry agreed with, since even if he had 10 mouths, he wouldn't have an argument to justify himself. The prisoner asked if the girl was all right, and he replied that the doctor had examined her the same night. Luckily, nothing serious had happened, but that made Rose remember how the young man had reacted at the moment of the incident. His soul had simply left his body for a few minutes. She asked him if he had really been a pilot, and Henry answered that in his active days he had shot down more than 50 enemy aircraft, which only made her more curious as to why he was so fearful. The young man stayed quiet for a moment, before replying that he had an older sister and a brother-in-law, Layla's parents. Then he asked if she knew about the bombing that had happened in Riorton, and Rose replied that she didn't, but noticed that he had used the verb in the past. Then Henry asked if she had been there that day, but there was no way Rose could have been present because the day that happened she was escaping for the first time. It had been a long time already. She was in Alcapez when she heard the news, saying that Riorton had disappeared. Henry confessed that his sister was in the city, along with his niece, who was still a newborn. And Rose, for her part, still had difficulty believing that this had really happened. Riorton was a huge city. It didn't make sense that it had disappeared just like that, overnight. Henry asked her if she knew what was funniest about that story, telling her that he could have prevented the destruction, and although he knew his sister and his niece were in the city, he hadn't stopped the bombing. But Rose thought that wasn't something that concerned her. Honestly, she didn't care that Cursed City had vanished, but that guy was really venting. She asked him why he hadn't stopped it, and Henry began to tell her that on that day, they identified an enemy squadron in the air during the flight. As soon as he noticed, he reported to Connor that it wasn't just one or two, but several. The squadron split into two groups. One side was going to the city of Malona, and the other was heading toward Riorton. Malona was the capital, and the other target was their hometown. He and his friend had to decide. The choice Connor made was to protect the capital. In the end, that was the right choice. He didn't really regret it. They had no choice. It was a situation in which there was no other option. After that, they flew without obstacles during the war, so he thought he had overcome what had happened. But as soon as the war ended, he couldn't get into a cockpit again. Something in his mind had broken. In the end, the prisoner was right. He wasn't who he had been before anymore, and he couldn't call himself a pilot anymore. Even so, it was all right, because his niece was there. After hearing the whole story, Rose began connecting the dots and asked him directly if he hated her, because also being from Riorton, she survived while his sister had died in that same city. Henry hesitated for a moment, but replied that yes. Rose told him it was all right to keep hating her, and he should continue that way because that's what normal people do. To be an admirable hero, it was necessary to have a witch to accuse without remorse. As if they were two sides of the same coin, a hero and a witch were like one body. Still, Henry admitted that he had gone there to apologize, and she asked him what he wanted to apologize for. The young man replied that he was sorry for causing trouble, and for showing her monsters while throwing fish into the sea. Rose was surprised to learn that those ideas had been his, and Henry replied that his commander couldn't have thought of things like that. Either way, if it hadn't been for her, he might not have been saved yet. So he thanked her for saving his niece, calling her for the first time by her true name, Rose Walker. And meanwhile, outside the room, the maids were talking about whether it was all right to leave the two of them alone in there. And in fact, there was no problem since those had been orders from Mr. Connor himself. Even so, they wondered if at least they shouldn't take a look. But before they could do that, Connor himself arrived at the room. But before he entered, still alone with Henry, Rose asked him if he thought that would come for free. The young man begged her not to ruin the mood since he was serious when he thanked her, but the prisoner insisted that she was serious too. Instead of simply saying, "Thank you," he should demonstrate the grand value of his sincerity. Henry asked if she was referring to money, because if that was it, he could even give it, but honestly wanted to know what she intended to do with it. But the girl told him to be a little more creative, because there were other things he could give her, clearly eyeing his keys. Realizing what she was talking about, Henry immediately refused, since that was not something he could do in his position, making the girl note how stingy the Leeville family was. But the young man said that wasn't the problem. Rose asked if the problem was because she was a prisoner, and if he really thought she was a murderer. Henry held himself back from answering, making her ask him if he had ever stopped to think that maybe she hadn't killed. And even if she had eliminated her husband hundreds of times, had he ever stopped and thought if there was a plausible reason? With just those questions, she had rented a triplex in his head, making him cover his ears so he wouldn't hear her arguments. Rose asked him if he knew that she couldn't lie, but Henry fired back, asking who would believe that. And regardless of the reason, the night before, she herself had said she didn't want a reward, so he wasn't obliged to do anything. The prisoner confirmed that she had said that, but since he had inflated his ego, what was the harm? Driven by guilt, Henry ended up being convinced and agreed to hand over the key, especially since it wasn't as if she would survive in a lifeboat. And knowing that, Rose asked him to come closer because she had a better idea. Pulling him by the sleeve, she dragged him unwillingly to tell him her plan and began whispering her idea in his ear. After hearing everything, the young man asked what she was planning now, but Rose replied that she wasn't planning anything, she just wanted a simple favor. And as Connor prepared to enter the room, she asked if he was really going to do it. The commander entered the room right after, visibly irritated, and looking at the two of them side by side, he asked what they were doing. Henry panicked immediately, and before he could say anything, his friend asked what he was doing in there. The blonde tried to explain that the situation wasn't what it looked like, but looking at the prisoner's state beside him, he couldn't believe that. For his own good, he advised him to be able to give a convincing answer for that situation, and realizing the hole he had gotten himself into, Henry started sweating cold. While he stammered something, Connor lost his patience and ordered him to leave immediately. And not only Henry, but the maids were also startled by the shout the commander gave. In the blonde's head, there was only one thought: I'm screwed. As soon as everyone left the room, Connor went to the prisoner and handed her a sheet, asking her to cover herself. The girl wrapped herself in the sheet, but started wondering what was going on. He just stood there in front of her staring. All he wanted was to know how far this would go. After some time thinking, Connor finally gave up and decided to say something. Gathering courage, he looked directly at the prisoner and asked if Henry had done something she didn't want. What he wanted to know was if by any chance he had forced her to do something, and that question made Rose freeze, and she immediately replied that no. But again, the commander asked if by any chance his subordinate had bothered her in some way, and the poor thing could only ask what exactly he thought had happened there. Connor told her that she could speak the truth, because depending on what had happened, he would make sure to replace her guard immediately until they reached the island, and also wouldn't allow anyone to get close to her. And that left Rose confused. She asked if by any chance the blonde wasn't his friend and helper, but the commander replied that if he had done something inappropriate, then he was no longer fit to help him. And apprehensive, Rose told him he was missing something very important. She was the witch of Alcapez. While Henry was a hero who had fought at his side in the war, before anything else, the blonde was his ally, not hers. But Connor asked what exactly that had to do with anything, leaving her speechless. Rose asked if by any chance he didn't even trust his own subordinates. And with that level of trust, she was impressed they had even managed to help each other in the war. Connor replied that he hated that kind of reasoning. People were not consistent. Even if his friend was a good subordinate, he still needed to improve in many things. Looking more seriously, he asked again if really nothing had happened. Rose felt bad and decided to clear everything up, saying that the two of them had only been talking. When asked about what, she replied it was about Lila, since Henry had been too embarrassed to thank her in front of the others, and it wasn't fun for her to toy with big kids like him. She wouldn't gain anything by doing that, and this made Connor ask what she meant by gain. What would a prisoner gain from a guard? And Rose replied that it was obvious. The very reaction he had when he saw the two of them together there proved it. Finally relaxing a little, Connor sat down and said that until that moment, he didn't understand how people fell for her lies. But now he saw that she had only been waiting for a chance like this. That was what she had been waiting for. It was easy to see when you paid attention. Rose grew more serious and asked if he really wanted to know why that happened. And she told him that in fact, it wasn't that she was deceiving everyone, it was the others who pretended to be deceived. Connor asked her what she meant by that, and she replied that it wasn't a matter of how good her lies were. People only heard what they wanted to hear. In the end, there was no one who wanted to know the truth. All that was needed was a good scapegoat they could accuse however they liked. In the end, she only said what she wanted to say, because no matter what she said, nothing would change. Still, it was true that he was a hero, because even knowing the situation she was in, he decided to care about a mere prisoner. With no words to respond to what Rose had said, he asked her if she also thought he was a hero. Rose countered, asking why it was strange for her to admire a hero, and he replied that it wasn't exactly that, but had his words cut off halfway when the prisoner admitted that she was also his fan. Before anything else, she had also been a citizen of the Empire, and when his photos were dropped, she kept each one. Connor was surprised to learn that, and the girl asked if by chance that was strange. After all, he should already know that, and she admitted that she only kept them because she thought he was handsome. Connor's brain began to reboot, slowly, and even Rose started realizing what she had just said. Her face began to blush immediately, and she asked herself why the hell she was saying that. In any case, she didn't intend to keep him there any longer. She needed to finish getting dressed, so she would ask the maids to return. She would also put the handcuffs back on as soon as she finished getting dressed, and if he was really worried that she would knock them out and escape, then he could leave the door ajar with Henry outside. Of course, he would need to stand with his back turned. However, interrupting her compulsive speech, Connor extended his hand toward her. He clarified that he wasn't there irritated, he had only been a little confused. When asked why, he replied it was because of what she had said earlier, about them being the same, because in fact, he thought she might be right. Rose had completely forgotten about that, and didn't even remember the context in which she had said that phrase. Connor remained there extending his hand, telling her to go already, and when asked where they were going, he replied that she needed to get dressed, because the dinner she had requested was waiting for her. Without realizing it, the girl ended up extending her hand in his direction. She only asked him to leave the room since she needed to get ready. However, the commander simply pulled her into an embrace, making the poor thing start to panic, until Connor simply threw her over his shoulder as if she were a sack of cement. Could it be that he had confused her with luggage? Rose asked him if there was really a reason to do that, since she only needed him to tell the maids to come back. But by that point, Connor no longer trusted her, because he knew very well what she would do. And to begin with, it had been a mistake to trust the captain's orders. Rose shouted that in that case, he only needed to leave Henry to guard, but the commander didn't even trust him anymore. From now on, he would guard her himself, and grabbing the handcuffs, he asked her to stretch out her hands. Honestly, he thought he had been very tolerant with her until now. Rose even tried to argue, but Connor cut her off. The captain, the maids, Henry, Lila, all of them had ended up being deceived, and he was the only one who still hadn't let down his guard in her company. Seeing this exaggeration, the prisoner asked him if by chance all of this was fear, and if he really believed in her escape, even though everyone there was armed. To her surprise, Connor replied that yes, he was really afraid of her. Rose tried to understand what that man was thinking. While he was informing the maids of what he was doing, the girl wondered why he feared her so much. Even though, from the moment she stepped on that ship, he had always been at an advantage. She was the one who should be afraid. Honestly, she wanted to know, what exactly was he afraid of? A little later, Connor, who was alone in his office, reflected on the situation, since putting a prisoner in a first-class cabin and giving her a bath was really unusual. He didn't think Henry and the other veterans of the team being attached to her was a problem. However, even if that was the case, he needed to be cautious. But while he was thinking, he was interrupted by the papers on his desk, which caught his attention. Those were the reports Henry had brought him. He had already read them in their entirety, but at the bottom there was a book. He had clearly ordered that to be burned and wondered if they had delivered it by accident. All the information contained in them was about Rose, always referring to her as the Witch of Alcapez, forming an extensive and detailed timeline, narrating from her prison escape to her luck in surviving the bombing. Seeing that, he wondered when that file had become so big, because in the beginning it was just a pastime, just a hobby he started to kill boredom. After the war, he had the same dream every night. It was a nightmare where he was dragged into completely black waters. He knew very well it wasn't real, but knowing that didn't help. In the end, he still saw himself as an unbreakable symbol of victory, and those nightmares shattered that definition, attacking all his greatest insecurities. When he woke from them, he couldn't sleep again, and whenever that happened, he opened the newspaper. He only skimmed the words without actually reading them, and while doing that, his eyes stopped on the word Riortan. That was the city destroyed by his choices, the one he abandoned, and yet there wasn't a single mention of his name. Instead, they spoke of a witch, the villain, the scapegoat in place of the name Ian Connor, a lie created by the media, the government, and the military, Rosenhowards. After that day, as if under the spell of a witch, he began to observe and record her name. And when it came to bad luck, the two of them really were alike. But if they were both considered equally unlucky, why did the world treat them differently? Wasn't the answer simple? She was an evil witch, and he the hero who saved the country. One killed a person out of malice, and the other had no choice but to kill 15,623 people. But if those sins could be weighed, which would be worse? In his private thoughts, he wished that she would run, not be captured, escape as far as she could, and survive. Witch or not, whether she had been falsely accused or whether she was a liar, regardless of all that, she was the only person he had been able to save. Who could have imagined that the indestructible war hero everyone praised had already become a madman rooting for a prisoner? But interrupting his introspection, little footsteps invaded his office. Looking in the direction of the sound, he was impressed to see Lila, asking permission to enter. He allowed it, but asked why she was carrying so many stuffed animals. And with the sweetest voice in the world, placing the stuffed animals on the table, she told him they were presents to give Rose later. She just didn't know which one would be good. Connor asked her why she brought them to him, and the little girl replied that she thought of making him choose one, since he knew her very well. The commander was surprised, and the little girl, pointing to the side, asked if that huge book was his. Explaining that a few days ago one of the maids tried to burn it, so she went there and forbade it, then put it back, because it belonged to her uncle Ian Connor. The young man asked how long she had known about this, and Lila replied that since it was trendy to look for news about Rose, she had been searching some newspapers to cut out, and precisely in the ones he had thrown away, all the articles about her had been cut out, every single one. After saying that, the little girl was invited to sit by his side, and Connor, as if walking on eggshells, tried to find a way to explain that book to the girl. First, he asked if she had told anyone else, but Lila replied that she hadn't even told her uncle, so he immediately made her promise to keep that book a secret, and that made the little girl ask if revealing it would get him in trouble, to which he answered yes, because Rose was a prisoner, and he was responsible for the prisoners. After hearing that, Lila promised not to reveal anything about that book, and also told him not to worry about it, because even if she told, no one would believe her, since she herself thought he hated Rose. And if that's the case, wouldn't anyone else who knew about it think the same? Connor replies that he doesn't hate that prisoner after all. His job is to escort her, so he can't feel that way. Besides, she even saved her. And although he had been rude to Rose earlier, he doesn't intend to do so anymore. And hearing that, with all her innocence, Lila asks if he is interested in the prisoner, but Connor answers not in the way she thinks. The little girl asks if at least she can like Rose, and he searches for words to explain the woman's crime, but Lila interrupts, saying she already knows the prisoner killed someone, but she also saved her. In that case, when you add a good thing with a bad thing, everything goes back to zero. And if that's true, shouldn't he like her too? But setting that aside, Lila needs Connor to choose quickly one of the stuffed animals, which her newest friend will like. The young man even tries to explain that since Rose is going to prison, her belongings will be taken away. But the little girl replies that at least she could keep the gift until she's imprisoned again. After all, every good deed must be rewarded. And that also reminds her that she has something to give Connor. Extending her hand, she gives him the coin she received from Rose. He explains that it's a lucky coin, so as long as he has one, everything will turn out fine. For now, he needs it more than she does, since he doesn't sleep well. However, Connor breaks the mood by asking where she got that coin from, and the poor little girl simply averts her eyes, avoiding answering. But it was already obvious. He couldn't let his guard down for even a second, and tells the little girl that next time she can't take anything from her, since they still don't know whether she is or isn't a witch. The poor thing even looks sad. Even so, Connor thanks her for the gift and promises to keep it carefully, since it would be uncomfortable to throw it away. For now, she needs to go back to where her grandfather is, since dinner will be ready soon, but before leaving, Lila asks where her uncle is, since he also needs to get ready. Connor replies that his friend is in charge of guarding Rose while she takes a bath, but the little girl tells him she had already checked that, and when she looked, her uncle wasn't at the door. That news makes the commander's heart stop for a second, and all that goes through his head is what Rose told him in the interrogation, about what she had to go through at the hands of rotten guards to escape. He runs towards the room, and when he arrives, he only sees the maids outside deciding whether to go in or not. The only thing he didn't know was why he was so angry over a prisoner. Before entering, he had to stop for a moment to calm down. He should already be used to hiding and burying his feelings before taking any action, and so he does. After all the confusion passed, it was up to poor Henry to explain what he was doing there. The poor thing was in tears, trying to convince his friend that he was only talking to the prisoner, but Connor remained static. After a long time, the commander finally turns to his friend and calls him noisy, telling him to be careful with his behavior, totally ignoring his pleas about not having done anything besides talking to the prisoner. To the war hero, that was a conversation that could easily have been interpreted as a threat by the prisoner, and that is what worried him. Meanwhile, Rose was preparing to enter the place, but she felt nervous, maybe because of the difference in class. However, it would be a waste to stay stuck back there, and the maid who helped her get ready encouraged her to go in, saying that everyone would surely be surprised. Turning to her, Rose asks if they'll be surprised because of her, and without hesitation, she replies, yes, since she looked extremely elegant, but that only made her more embarrassed, starting to rethink if she should go or not. The maid didn't intend to let that happen and pushed her into the room at once. Connor and Henry immediately turned, seeing her stumble inside, still shackled, and in a beautiful, shiny dress. Rose surprised everyone with her beauty. The two young men glued their eyes on her the moment she stepped into the place. When Rose noticed their stares, she froze in the corner. Exactly what were they looking at? The two stood still and silent as if they had seen an apparition, and like that, it was impossible to feel even minimally comfortable in that place. To make things worse, Henry looked at the girl with the most serious expression he had and asked who the hell she was. And that question left her wondering if her sentence would increase if she kicked a guard. Apparently, people couldn't believe that this was really Rose Walker. The worst part was that Henry wasn't joking about it. He truly hadn't recognized her. Rose even teases, asking if he isn't just doing that to trick her and call her stinky again. But the young man replies that he would never do that. And looking closely, she even finds him handsome, though he isn't her type. But at the very least, he's trustworthy. But when she was about to get closer to the young man, Connor steps between the two and, looking at his friend, tells him that he's forbidden to come within 1 meter of the prisoner. Poor Henry is obviously confused and asks since when that stupid rule existed, since he thought everything had already been settled, and even though his commander agreed, he still didn't think the blondie was trustworthy. Henry even asked why, but they had already argued about this before. And the reason was simple. No matter how charismatic or hostile prisoners are, they will still be extremely dangerous. Besides, he couldn't understand how someone who was always growling at Rose could suddenly become such good friends with her. But for Henry, that didn't matter, and he asked if Connor really thought he would let the prisoner escape, but his silence answered for itself. The commander only looked at Rose, who froze immediately, and said that there was no way to know if the two had planned something while they were in the bathroom. And the young woman stiffened, since that was almost as if he had read her mind. Henry tells Connor that the lady just asked about the menu, since there was a dish she didn't want to eat, so he had to pass that along to the chef. Obviously, the commander turned to her and asked if that was true, and Rose confirmed it, but complained about Henry's lack of loyalty and sense. When Connor asked what item on the menu was causing so much trouble, he was interrupted. Alex and Lila had finally arrived for dinner, and the little girl was as radiant as ever upon seeing her favorite witch present. Rose greets the little girl, but quietly asks Connor why she was there, and the young man replies that it was probably the captain's idea. Approaching with short steps, the little girl says the prisoner looks like a true princess. She's so beautiful, and Rose returns the compliment, but Connor interrupts the two's conversation, asking the girl not to get close to the prisoner. Lila even tries to argue, saying she hadn't even properly thanked her savior, but Connor says she's already said enough. And from now on, it's dangerous to get close to that woman. The poor little one's eyes fill with tears, and sadly, she hides behind her uncle's legs. And not a single person in that room thought that wasn't the cutest thing in the world, except Connor, of course. Rose had already realized how merciless Commander Connor was, and most likely the only person capable of challenging him would be Captain Alex, who at that very moment was scolding the soldier for suspecting everyone. Connor even tries to argue something, but the old man had already stopped listening long ago and apologizes on behalf of his subordinate. He also announces that the meal will be ready soon, so she only needs to wait. And he says he'd like to be able to remove her shackles during dinner, but Connor only had to call his attention once for the old man to change his mind, albeit reluctantly. He then asks his son, Henry, to help Miss Walker during her meal, basically to feed her bites directly. And the young man gets a little confused, asking if they can't have the servants do it instead, but his father is inflexible. And before the poor young man could try to argue, Connor steps in front of him and says he can't do that since he's forbidden to approach the prisoner. And because of that, Connor himself volunteers. Everyone is shocked, and Rose herself seems the most confused there. And seeing this reaction, he asks if perhaps he can't do that, but it's not like anyone there could stop him. So he asks Rose directly if she has any complaints about it, but the young woman says she doesn't, and in that case, everything is fine. Pulling her by the arm, Connor begins to lead her to the table, but for Rose, it only feels stranger by the minute. For some reason, his gaze seems different from when they first met. It's possible she's just mistaken, but somehow, his gray eyes seem to pierce her even deeper. What the young man had said before immediately comes back to her mind, when he thought that the two of them really could have something in common. But Rose ends up convincing herself that it was only an illusion, a sweet delusion she had created to escape the miserable reality in which she lived. Connor's gray eyes always seemed irritated when they looked at her. They were not a scorching red or a freezing blue, but rather a color difficult to decipher. What really hides behind those eyes, she doesn't need to know, but she wants very much to find out, though she is afraid, because when a rat forgets its own place, all that remains is its destruction. But pulling her out of her daydreams, Rose realizes that she is still holding Connor's hand, so she asks him, until when will he keep doing that? Connor immediately lets go of her hand after hearing that, startled. Quickly pulling it away, he tells Rose that his intention, in truth, had been to pull the chain, not hold her hand. Alex hears that and becomes furious, rightfully so. How could someone be so rude as to drag a lady by the chains of her shackles? Even worse, a guest. It took his son holding him back to keep the old man from lashing out at the young man. Connor goes a little quiet after that and apologizes, saying he hadn't meant it on purpose, but the girl understood, so it wasn't that big of a problem. He still tries to explain that he only wanted to pull the chains and not hold her by the hand, and apparently didn't understand that that was exactly the problem, but Rose just repeats that she already understood. She knew very well what had happened. She always knew. His holding her hand didn't mean anything. It was all just a delusion. The phrases she had heard from that hero in her youth, that he would always protect everyone, and no harm would come to them. She always knew those were empty promises, but still believed in those lies, because she needed something to believe in. Even if they were lies, mere illusions, a fantasy. In truth, she had fallen in love with the fantasy she had created with him. It was silly, because even in a situation like that, she was too embarrassed to look into his eyes. Connor tells her not to misunderstand the situation, and the girl asks if she looks like an idiot, questioning what he means by misunderstanding. The young man goes on saying he hadn't meant to do it on purpose. And again, Rose repeats that she already understood. Hearing it only makes her feel worse. It's almost as if he's reading her heart and doing it on purpose. To make it worse, she can't forget the phrase he had broadcast through the loudspeakers, completely throwing off her focus. But she knew very well she needed to stop dreaming with that lie, and returns to what matters. Finally, taking a proper look at the dining room, she is impressed with how fancy the place is, even letting out that kind of builder's whistle, quickly apologizing afterward to Alex, but for him it was fine. Honestly, he agreed that the place was quite extravagant. They don't always have dinners like this. Though it looked like a formal dinner, there were very few guests, since the circumstances were unusual. Regardless, it was time to begin dinner. And sitting down, Rose pauses and thinks that from the moment she changed her clothes until she entered there, she hadn't seen a single person walking around. But that was understandable. It wouldn't look good for a captain and a commander to be seen treating a prisoner that way. Looking at the dishes served, she is impressed, because everything looks appetizing. But when she prepares to eat, she is interrupted by Henry, who tells her to wait. He asks if the girl planned to eat shackled as she is. Besides, the captain hadn't given the order for everyone to begin, which leaves Rose confused, since she had heard Alex give the order for dinner to begin. Henry explains that starting dinner doesn't mean beginning to eat. Only the soup had been served so far, and it's necessary to wait for the appetizers. The young man is truly shocked that Rose has no etiquette skills, and the girl, embarrassed, begins to get irritated with him, because obviously she has no knowledge about etiquette rules. She had never eaten at such a fancy dinner before, so why did he have to treat her like some snob? The fact that she doesn't fit into a place like that is clear as day, but her revolt is interrupted by Connor, who calls her attention. He offers her a spoonful of soup and brings the spoon to her mouth. Rose even tries to refuse, but before she realized it, she was already eating the soup, and Connor was asking her if she wanted more. Obviously, she accepted. And Lila, watching that, clapped her hands in happiness at seeing the two so close. Henry, on the other hand, gets a huge scolding from his commander, since as far as the two of them knew, it didn't matter in what order you ate. Once in the stomach, it all became the same thing, and the blonde hadn't worried about that when he was on the battlefield. The poor guy even tries to defend himself, but the damage was done. Connor still repeats that it's better for the blonde to stay quietly in his corner because he had already warned before that Henry couldn't be less than a meter away from her. And contrary to what everyone thought, it wasn't a joke. And technically, it also meant he couldn't even be in that dining room. Meanwhile, Rose kept stuffing her belly, but was bothered that Connor wasn't eating, though the commander didn't mind, and said that the only thing she needed to worry about was enjoying the dinner. And if that was the case, the girl took the opportunity to ask for another piece of meat. However, while eating, she found it funny that he treated her so delicately, while keeping his face frozen in that serious expression. But what she really cared about was how delicious that food was. One after the other, she kept asking for little bites of every dish that appeared in front of her, and Connor was the one responsible for cutting and feeding her each little thing she asked for, almost like a dream. But when she asked for another bite of meat, the commander told her to eat more slowly, or she'd end up choking. That irritated Rose, who asked if he got annoyed watching her eat, but Connor never said that, and would like her to stop putting words in his mouth. All he said was to go more slowly, or she'd end up choking, and if she kept shoving so much down, she'd end up with a stomachache. But even so, Rose complained, because that wasn't what his face conveyed. Staring at her with his usual serious face, Connor replied that he couldn't help it, because that's simply what his face normally looked like. Rose thought all that was stranger than it really should be, because Connor kept responding to her provocations, unlike before, when he would just ignore them. But interrupting her thoughts, the young man asked if by any chance she had been a nurse in the past, and the prisoner answered no, which made Connor wonder where she had learned first aid, since he hardly ever saw that in the Empire. Then he finally questioned her if by chance she had used magic at that moment. Rose opened a mischievous smile and replied, "Whenever a woman does something incredible, people tend to say she's a witch." She hadn't been a nurse, but her husband had been a doctor, or to be more exact, a quack without a diploma, but she had learned a bit by watching him. His name was Hindley, and he had indeed taken a witch as his wife, but not Rose. Emily was the witch. After she revealed that her husband had been a quack doctor, Rose witnessed the most uncomfortable silence of her life. Apparently, everyone suddenly remembered that she was a murderer. That served as a reminder of how good Connor was at ruining the mood. She could say that because that story had already been in the newspapers. There was no reason to ask her to repeat it in her own words. As a way to break the silence, Alex ended up asking her how old she was, still a little nervous. He couldn't trust the information in the newspapers since they were often biased, with some even saying she was in her 70s, hiding it with magic. Rose realized how much the former war hero was trying and decided to answer. Just as the Imperial newspaper had said, she was 25 years old. That made Alex curious, since if she was that young, then at what age had she gotten married? And the girl answered that she had married when she was 15. The old man was impressed by how young she had been when she married and asked if it had been her parents' decision. But Rose said no, since she came from an orphanage. That made the atmosphere even heavier, and the only person who thought all that was normal was Rose herself. Henry revolted and banged the table, saying that was madness. A 15-year-old girl getting married? That made him ask how old her husband had been at the time, but Rose questioned whether that really mattered since he was dead anyway. And while chewing her piece of meat, she felt the atmosphere grow heavy again. She hadn't meant to say it like that on purpose, but it was true. Connor reprimanded the two of them, asking them not to say cruel things without reason and to just eat, especially since Lila was there. But the little girl said it was fine, since she had already read the news about Rose. However, Connor told her that even so, it was better for her to focus on her own meal, which didn't stop the girl from finishing her sentence, saying she already knew that her savior had been the cause of her own husband's destruction. That makes the commander harsher and order her to stop talking, leaving the little girl sad. But angry, she decides not to be quiet and asks if it's possible that Rose didn't do it. Connor explains to her that the prisoner had already been found guilty and sentenced, but Lila reminds them that Rose had always claimed to be innocent and asks why no one listens to her. The commander, cold as always, tells her that no one listens because it's a lie. It may be true that the little girl survived thanks to her help, however, it's also a fact that Rose killed her own husband. The girl even understands that, but says that if no one believed her, just like they don't believe Rose, she would be very sad. Connor prepares to keep scolding the little girl, but Rose steps on his foot and orders him to stop fighting with her and just eat in silence. But he stares at the prisoner and asks her directly why she gave that coin to Lila. Rose is confused at first until she remembers what he's talking about and answers that from the beginning that coin wasn't hers, but the girl's. She only borrowed it to distract her and then gave it back. Deep down, she knew very well the reason for that question. It was a reminder of the lie she told. She had lied to Lila when she said it was a lucky coin. And if she lied, she was a liar. The little girl, crying, said that her savior hadn't lied, and that it really was a a lucky coin. The truth is, when coincidences overlap, sometimes lies become reality. Rose tells her that it's all right and that there's no problem with what Connor said. She knows very well what she did, knows very well that children are naive, and that's why it's easy to take advantage of their little hearts. She feels grateful that the little girl defended her, but the truth is she only used her innocence. Breaking the heavy atmosphere, one of the maids arrives and asks if she can clear the dishes from the table and bring the next ones, being answered by Rose, who says yes. She keeps imagining what kind of fancy dish is going to show up now, until something finally catches her attention. Among the countless delicious things that were on the table, there was one in particular she wanted, and when Connor asked her what she would like to eat, she didn't hesitate to answer. Sweating cold, she chose the manhwa fruit. Connor split the small fruit in half, and with a spoon scooped out the pulp, bringing it to the prisoner's mouth. But right after eating it, while everyone else enjoyed the dishes, she began to feel ill. Connor was the first to look in her direction when the captain asked her a question and she didn't respond, but his eyes froze when he saw the first drop of blood fall. Rose was bleeding from her mouth, and it was possible to see the tears of despair running down her face. Everyone began to scream and worry and ask what had happened, but Rose wasn't panicking. She had finally done it. She was very sorry that Lila had to see it, but she couldn't simply go back to prison. She needed more time. Now she truly understood that there was no savior in this world, and patience leads nowhere. So even if it hurt her, she needed to save herself. Connor must act as she expects, and that's exactly what happens. Desperate, he runs toward her and holds her in his arms. Even if only for a brief moment, she hopes to catch him with his guard down. A few minutes later, when the initial shock passed, Connor asked the ship's doctor who had poisoned the food, and the man answered that he was sure it hadn't been poison. Connor found that unlikely, since she had spat blood, and the servant began nervously explaining that it was true it had been because of the fruit, but not because the fruit was poisoned. And he began to think the poor guy had only gone there because he heard the commotion caused by a supposed poisoning, and looking now, that atmosphere was definitely no joke. Including the soldier who had taken her to the cabin, it seemed Connor was the only one still in his right mind. But that thought quickly crumbled when he saw his face silently exploding with rage, his clothes covered in blood. However, that reaction was understandable, since that must have been a very important mission for him. And interrupting his thoughts, Connor asked what could have caused it if it hadn't been poison. The servant explained that nothing had been put in the fruit, and the girl probably just had a unique constitution, some kind of allergy, for example, and that's why her body reacted badly to certain foods. That couldn't be called poisoning. At most, a food intoxication, since the other people at the table were fine. And that made Connor ask if the man thought Rose had done it on purpose. But the young man didn't know how to answer. If the girl didn't know, then it was probably an accident. But if she knew, then it had been some kind of scheme. Or then, it could have been a more desperate attempt to escape than just throwing herself into a sea of monsters. That's a very interesting hypothesis. And what if Rose had really tried to put an end to it all? It wouldn't be unusual, since she's a prisoner condemned to Mount Island. Sometimes it's better to die like that than to reach the island. Connor asks the man if she's going to die, but he answers no. The doctor has been saying that for a long time. The girl has already been treated and is just sleeping now. However, the commander doesn't understand why she's still unconscious, and the doctor explains that her body weakened from lack of nutrients, and it will be difficult to wake up after fainting from lack of energy. Hearing that makes the commander ask the doctor if things continued at that pace, the prisoner would die. The doctor couldn't answer that, since that woman definitely isn't a normal person. She's someone who's been through every kind of situation, and even so, it's common for people as strong as her to die in prison. Even if she died from another illness, it wouldn't be strange, so he can't say what's more likely, her surviving or dying. While he's talking, Connor is approached by a piercing cry, and when he looks back, he sees Lila running toward him in tears, asking if he would put Rose back in the ship's prison. The little girl already knew because she'd been there before. If her friend went back there already sick, she would definitely get worse and die. Gripping tightly the fabric of his pants, she asks if they can let Rose rest a little longer before sending her back there. Connor puts his hand on her head affectionately, and turning to one of the servants, orders them to put the girl in a cabin, and when asked which cabin he was talking about, he answers his own cabin, causing shock, since a prisoner would stay in the same cabin as a commander. Connor asks if by any chance they're worried about him now, and nervously the man answers no, but that wasn't the point of his question. However, Connor was inflexible about it. He himself would keep an eye on Rose. His mission is to transport the prisoner to Mount Island and to keep an eye specifically on her. It had been a long time since he forgot about the mission. It had become very personal for him, and he couldn't understand why. He even tried to forget it out of fear, but it didn't work. The only thing he wanted to know was why he was worried about her, even though she was a murderer. In the end, he would only be the person who would take her to a place worse than death, but he didn't know how to feel whenever he heard in his head Rose's voice admitting that she admired him, which only worsened his dilemma. Returning to Rose, while she was unconscious, she dreamed of her past. In the dream, she spoke with Emily, who watched her lying on the bed and complained because they'd said she would be fine. But look at that, she ended up bedridden. Rose, still weak, looked at her friend and asked if she was going to die. She turned and said that, as she'd said before, that's not going to happen. Everyone is born with a different body, and for some, even common herbs and foods can be poisonous. What she really wanted to know was if there was something Rose couldn't eat, because she needed to find that out to understand why she got sick before preparing any medicine. Rose asks with a trembling voice if she really has that special body that can eat some foods, and Emily says yes. Precisely because of that, she almost died. But she needs to focus on the problem and asks the girl to think again what she ate before that made her this sick. Sweating from fever, Rose explains that the orphanage director used to eat purple fruits when she was little and her body would itch just from being near them. Then Emily warned her not to eat any of those fruits from now on, or she could end up dying the next time. Rose agrees, but she didn't know the name of those fruits and asks her friend if she knows. The fruit she's talking about is manhwa. Her friend probably told her the name, so she'd avoid it carefully. And whenever her life became unbearable and painful, Rose remembered that name. Suffocating might not seem like the most comfortable death, but at least it was better than being beaten to death by Hindley. But it was different this time. If she could die so easily, she wouldn't have suffered escaping prison twice. After a long time, Rose finally wakes up in Connor's cabin, wondering where she was. But after the initial shock, she regains awareness of what was happening. As expected, the commander was very meticulous and even chained her to the bed, but it was still better than being put back in prison, a result that made everything worth it. Apparently, they had changed her clothes too, probably because the dress had been stained with blood. Unfortunately, she couldn't try that tactic again, but now she felt as if her whole body was on fire, though she kept wondering if Lila was okay after seeing that, until her thoughts were interrupted by a deep voice calling her. Alex was in the room, and he asked how the young lady was feeling. Rose hadn't noticed his presence there, but the old man said it was no problem. And honestly, he was more worried about her, asking her not to get up and to rest a little, since the doctor had asked her to stay in bed. Rose felt a bit awkward, but ended up agreeing. Taking the chance, Alex looked into her eyes and asked if she knew how much time remained until they reached Mount Island. The girl was confused by the question, and he rephrased it, asking if she wasn't interested in knowing how much time was left until their arrival. Rose stayed silent, and the captain informed her that they would reach the island in 3 days. At the moment, they continued heading west, even with the wind blowing against them, since ever since the invention of the steam engine, it had become easy to go against the wind. That made the ex-war hero think about how amazing young people were. With their inventions, they overcame gravity and flew into the sky. Alex asked if she didn't also think that was amazing. Rose, still a bit distracted, asked if that was the gentleman's office, but the old man explained that no, that was Connor's cabin, which made the girl ask if the commander had given up his own room, and he answered that it was almost like that, since in the end, the brat had been so stubborn that Alex ended up pretending to agree with it. But at that moment, Connor had only gone out for a smoke, something that curiously impressed Rose. But thinking about it, it wasn't as if she had never seen him smoke before. What was curious about it was that normally pilots were forbidden to smoke, and she asked Alex if that was true. The old man just looked into her eyes and asked rhetorically if the war hadn't already ended, making the girl ask if that would still be correct, since in theory, Connor was still an active pilot, as planes didn't only fly during wars. And she was answered that, in fact, he intended to resign, since he had already done enough during his time of service. Rose was surprised to learn that, and even kind of felt sorry for him, and Alex told her that Connor had been very worried about her during that time, making her question if that straight-laced robot hadn't regretted it. After all, he seemed like the type who hated straying from the rules, so he was probably the type of person who would be bothered to do such an unnecessary favor, like letting her sleep in a cabin. Alex even agreed with that. Connor really was rougher than people made him seem, but he wasn't as cold-blooded as he appeared. That reminded him that something was still kept there, a gift he had given the boy when he was 12 years old, after he had managed to get an expedition to the Kintari Islands. The old man pulled out a jar with some plants inside. It was a luminous moss, perfect to keep in a room instead of a gas lamp. And looking at Rose, he asked if she would like to see it up close. Taking the chance, he also showed her the telescope and the map he had given the boy as a gift, saying that as cold as Connor tried to seem, he often showed affection in the form of gifts. Using the map, he showed her the route they had taken until reaching Mount Island, pointing with his finger where the journey had started, and since the sea current was good, they had already traveled a good part of the way. That map was a gift from more than 15 years ago, which he had given to Connor. Rose asked if the old man had known the hero Ian Connor since he was a child, and Alex explained that the boy had been a senior to his son Henry in the military academy, so he had known him since he was a child, when he had first entered the military academy as a little boy of 10 years old. Rose commented that the two must have been good friends, but the old man explained that this wasn't true, since Henry used to be furious with Connor, always saying that he was so stubborn and strict that he looked like the devil himself, so vacations were probably his only joy in that academy. But it wasn't as if any child liked going to school, and Alex told the girl that although those had been the circumstances that led them to know each other, the truth was that even without his son's help, he would have still met him, since he had always been a boy who stood out too much, making Rose comment that Connor probably had very proud parents. To her, it was obvious, even without observing him for long, that Connor seemed to have grown up as a proud son who received much love, living in a mansion with his kind parents, with maids and butlers, in a spacious garden, with many cooks who acted as if they were taking care of a little puppy. And honestly, she couldn't even dream of such a perfect family. But Alex told her that, in truth, she couldn't even dream of how the boy really grew up. The truth was that Connor had no parents, for he lost both when he was very young. They died because of the plague, and Connor was very young at the time. After many disputes among his relatives over the inheritance, he ended up joining the army when he grew older, and those unscrupulous people grew angry when they heard that. But that had been the best option for him, since the inheritances and properties of cadets were administered by the state until they came of age. The poor boy had to mature quickly, and because of that, he hardly ever showed his feelings, never being sincere about them, probably why he preferred to deal with his problems alone or to rid himself of such feelings. As for Alex, he felt pity seeing a child forced to grow old too soon. Precisely because of this, he asked Rose not to try to end her own life. That made everything seem clearer to her. The old man had explained all that just to tell her this, for he had misunderstood and thought she had tried to take her own life. Awkwardly, the girl tried to explain that he may have misunderstood the situation, and that it really was just a coincidence, since she had always wanted to try the fruit, and it turned out she was allergic. Alex did not accept this explanation, and with a sad look, he told her that he had also had a daughter, and the two had much in common. She was his first daughter after 15 years of marriage. They had her late and lost her early, but Rose didn't think that was true. Most likely, he had simply associated the two because of their blonde hair, but she didn't believe it possible they had anything in common. Still, how could a father who lost his daughter make that distinction? Perhaps after losing her, his heart tightened whenever he saw a young lady of the same age. And in the end, he probably never gave up that habit, even toward a prisoner like her. Alex changed the subject of the conversation and asked if Rose really was feeling better, and she answered yes. She felt very well now, but to the old man, the girl still didn't seem well, and he asked her to rest a little longer, something she agreed to. For now, he only advised Rose to take care of herself, for as he had said before, they still had time before reaching Mount Island. And honestly, he thought Miss Walker was someone who would not give up until the end. After all, that was what she had done up to that point. As for Rose, throughout her life, she had believed her skill was in picking out crucial pieces of information from random conversations, and this applied to that talk, the direction of the wind, the temperature, and the weather the captain had told her about. Even though she couldn't fully understand it due to her lack of knowledge, she was still certain of one thing: she needed to head east. That night, before sleeping, she kept observing the jar of moss in her hand, and it really glowed. Looking at it that way, it almost seemed like a lighthouse, something everyone ends up seeing after wandering the open sea for a while. But back to her plan. What she needed to do now was find the key. If she could get hold of it, or at least of the weapon Connor carried on his waist, maybe she would have a chance. The problem was what she would do afterward. She would be lying if she said she hadn't felt fear after seeing those creatures in the sea, but she had always known how to overcome fear, and that made her remember the moment when her husband died, when she held Emily's shoulders and begged her to go to Walpurgis Island. For since she was a witch, she would probably survive there. Emily even tried to argue, worried about what would happen to her friend, but Rose told her she would be fine and would never die. That was the day she had taken her bravest action. It was the brightest moment of her humble life, and whenever she thought of that moment, a flame lit in her chest. That flame burned away any fear, urging her to fly again, under the promise that they would meet again in the future. And that flame was still burning, and it gave her the certainty that in the end she would win, never again to be defeated, at least not by any creature. Connor arrived at the room sometime later, still in the dark, and sitting on the bed, Rose asked him where he had been, for she had been waiting for him. The commander only stared at her with indifference. And even with the girl obviously trying to seduce him, he only asked how she was feeling, making her wonder if he would really act as if he hadn't seen anything and ask where he had been all this time. Connor answered that he had been in front of the cabin the whole time, and Rose said that was probably a difficult task. asking if that kind of thing wasn't the job of his subordinates, but the commander answered that transporting her had been a direct order from the minister to him. Honestly, the man thought she was underestimating his reputation, since out there she was more famous than he himself was. In the end, Rose ended up agreeing with that, because in fact, she was more known, and asked if now that the dinner was over, she would go back to prison. Connor answered that no, she could stay there until they reached the island, because the ship's doctor had said she had health problems, which made the girl wonder where he would stay, since that had been his cabin until then. Answering her, the man said the sofa would do, and Rose asked if the poor thing didn't have other cabins to spend the night, but he only told her that that was his cabin, so there was no reason to go somewhere else. Besides, it was better she didn't even bother trying anything, because while she was there, he could see everything, and that only reinforced her theory that Connor could read minds. Also, noticing his waist, she realized the key had disappeared. Apparently, he wasn't as dumb as the others. And still trying to find a gap, Rose proposed that she stay on the sofa and he on the bed, but the commander refused, because the sofa was lighter than the bed, and that made the girl ask what one thing had to do with the other. After all, even if she jumped into the sea with the sofa, in Connor's own words, which he completed for her, she would end up dying. He said he didn't intend to give her a choice, and Rose asked if his idea was to keep her tied up in that room, being answered that yes. And that answer made the girl ask if he hadn't heard what she told the captain earlier, since he had been at the door, about not planning to die. But Connor, with a cold look, asked her if the situation was so confusing that she didn't understand, and said that she knew that eating the fruit could kill her, so she used the excuse of wanting to taste it to make Henry prepare it for her. Rose even tried to deny it, but he only asked if it had been refreshing to do that, or at least fun. The girl tried to explain, but the commander, as always, was not willing to hear a single word from her, mainly because she had even taken care to make him give her the fruit that could kill her with his own hands. Rose immediately noticed that she had finally made him angry. After observing him for the last few days, she noticed that he was not someone who got agitated easily, and hardly ever raised his voice. So if he had been thinking calmly, he would know it didn't make sense for her to try to take her own life. And if he was angry because of that, it meant he had lost the ability to think calmly, and Rose knew very well she couldn't lose that opportunity, and immediately began her act. Crying, she told him that she would die even if they reached the island, so she saw no point in continuing with this. Even if she survived, she would be tortured and die working. And if that was the case, wouldn't it be better to end everything right there? But what Rose was really thinking was how perfect the moment was to make him feel sorry for her. Connor, for his part, asked her if she really thought she could decide what would happen with her own life by herself, because if that were the case, he wouldn't let it happen. If the handcuffs on her wrists weren't enough, maybe he should tie her up completely until she controlled herself. Rose, being pulled by the chains, asked if he was planning to chain her even more, and Connor confirmed that yes, because what else could he do? If her intention was to try some more nonsense, he could even chain her completely to the bed. Rose answered that in that case, she would simply bite her tongue, but the commander said he would put a gag. He simply couldn't understand how someone who had escaped so many prisons was trying to throw her own life away so suddenly. Rose screamed and asked how Connor had the audacity to say that, because the reason was obvious. This time she couldn't escape. In the first place, he was the one who had shown her a sea full of monsters, who had frightened her by showing the death that awaited in the mouths of those creatures. Connor, with his head down, said that he really had been cautious, but he never thought that would lead her to try something like that. He had understood that she was the kind of person who wouldn't give up until her last breath. That surprises Rose. Did Connor really understand her? That was simply revolting. How could he understand? How much did he really think he understood about her? She only wanted him to answer that. He only knew her by those names: Witch of Alcapez, Murderer. So what did he really know about her life? How did he have the audacity to say he understood her? And Connor asked her not to be angry, because obviously he didn't know her that well, but he surely knew more than she thought. That was all he meant. She asked him if he really thought he knew her just because he had read some newspapers, and Connor confirmed that he did indeed read the newspapers about her, and that made her more curious to know what exactly he had been trying to tell her all this time. After a minute of silence, Connor only said one sentence: "Don't die." That left her confused, but the commander continued asking her to promise not to give up on her life, and to remain calm while she was on the ship. But Rose asked why she should do that. For whom should she do that? Did he really expect her to give up her last chance to screw up his life? After all, she was already considered dead anyway. Connor told her that was true. She would die anyway, because she probably wouldn't last even a month on the Isle of Monty, and she would hardly be able to escape. But Rose already knew that. What he was really trying to do was make a proposal, one that wouldn't be bad for her. Taking the handcuffs in his hand and pulling the key from his pocket, Connor removed her chains. Rose finally found herself free after so long, and asked what he was doing, but without answering her, he just pulled her from the bed, finally putting her on her feet. The feeling was strange, for Rose it was as if even walking was easier without the handcuffs. Connor's proposal was very simple. He would remove her chains while she was being watched by him. It wouldn't be for long, but at least that way she could sleep peacefully and eat properly too. She could have time to think about her past in peace until the end of the trip. The only thing he wanted was for her to make a promise. Promise not to choose the easier path. All of that was strange. He wanted Rose to promise not to try to take her own life, almost as if he really wanted her not to die. And that made Rose wonder what exactly this man wanted. But honestly, it didn't matter what the reason was. The important thing was that she had no reason to refuse that proposal and asked if he was sure about this. Connor hated jokes, so he wasn't kidding. And after hearing that, the girl accepted the proposal. There wasn't much time left until the ship arrived at the island in 3 days. However, even with the short time, it wasn't as if she couldn't show her happiness. From now on, her role was that of someone who had given up everything in life, and she had to act as if she were enjoying her last days of freedom. So Rose turned to Connor and asked him to bring her a drink, something very strong, and also begged for a cigarette because she was desperate to get her hands on one. After all, even prisoners condemned to death could have a last meal. And besides, it would only be 3 days, so it wouldn't hurt to fulfill her wishes a little. She asked if he couldn't at least do that, and Connor, hesitant, began to pull his pack of cigarettes from his pocket and ended up giving in. In his own room, she began to smoke and felt as if she had come back to life. The commander just sat beside her watching and said he would bring some alcohol the next day, but she was too focused on her cigarette and only invited him to smoke a little by her side. The only bad thing was that it was already ending, but Connor ended up giving her a treat, letting her smoke one more, bringing a smile to her face. However, Rose knew very well what would happen. He would probably tell her to sleep after finishing that one, but it would be a waste of time to do that. She needed to say something to gather information, but didn't know exactly what to ask without seeming suspicious. Still, she decided to risk it and said she had something to ask him. Connor, dedicated to letting her enjoy a little of life, decided to answer her doubt and asked what she wanted to know. And while taking another drag, Rose asked when he started smoking, since pilots weren't allowed to do that. The man answered that he started when the war ended, but that wasn't the answer she expected. She just wanted to know why. But Connor only said he simply felt like it. However, Rose didn't think that matched him, especially since he was a pilot. The sky was what suited that man the most. That was precisely why he shone the brightest there. Every time the Imperial Squadron passed like a flock of migratory birds, she would spend a long time looking up, trying to watch. Since Connor was the commander, she was sure he would be in the first plane, and she always tried to catch him with her hands. When she did that, for a moment her body, which was bound to the ground, seemed to have risen to the sky. But she had no interest in winning or losing the war. She just liked him crossing the blue sky. She liked the feeling of freedom that it gave her. Connor only answered that he was no longer a pilot, not since the war ended. But if he was going to keep giving vague answers, Rose would take the chance to tease him a little. So she asked why he still wasn't married, and that was enough to destabilize him. Connor was stunned, so Rose repeated the question. She wanted to know why he hadn't married yet, since the war was over, or if at least he had a girlfriend. The commander already thought she was getting too curious, but the truth was that she wasn't the only one. He had fans all over the Empire who also wanted to know. So he answered that it was very common for pilots to die during the war, and afterwards there weren't many left to gather. And because of that, many ended up thinking it was better not to start a family. But Rose didn't think that answered her question, and wanted to know if there were soldiers who did get married, or if at least he went to war carrying the picture of a beloved inside his cap, like one of those classic cliches. Connor gave a slight smile and said that was true. There were people who did that, but not everyone did something so foolish. However, what caught the girl's attention the most in his words was that laugh. And for a second, she even thought she had imagined it. But that wasn't a reason to stop provoking him. And she asked if his personality had always been that dry and melancholic, and explained she wasn't trying to insult him, she just thought it was different from what the media usually showed. Connor replied that at first, he didn't match that image. It had been a difficult adaptation. That only made her more curious to know why he had forced himself to be that way, and the commander replied that he just thought it was necessary. But this time, Rose agreed with what he said. Really, it was his fault for being too handsome, but it was still better than trying to do that without the right looks. Connor laughed and said that was true. At that point in the conversation, Rose was almost about to faint, because that serious, robotic man was actually laughing. The guy even admitted that he was handsome. And speaking of himself, Connor added that he didn't think marriage was really necessary. Rose understood that, but said that if it were him, he'd have at least 3 wives, because it would be better than having just one ugly guy. It would be worth it to share a handsome guy with 2 other women, as long as he was beautiful. When she was young, she realized that the existence of a man wasn't really necessary to live, but rather an accessory. But that didn't mean she killed her husband, and hearing that Connor asked what nonsense she was talking about, since as far as he knew, the Empire had never allowed marriage with multiple people. Rose laughed at that, and said that apparently the war hero didn't know anything about the world, explaining to him that it wasn't just in rich neighborhoods like his, but in the outskirts. Even ugly people had several wives. Then she decided to tell him a curiosity. In fact, she had been Hidley's second wife. She only told him because she thought he'd be interested in knowing that, especially since she had never mentioned it anywhere else. After hearing that last piece of information, Connor told her to go to sleep, and she asked if the hero wasn't interested in hearing a little more about her. And getting closer, she said she had much more to tell, things that weren't in the articles, a secret and interesting story. But to her misfortune, Connor wasn't the least bit interested in that chatter, and just tossed her back onto the bed, while Rose tried to convince him to listen at least a little. Her plan to get information had officially failed, and to make matters worse, she wasn't in the mood to sleep. She needed to talk at least a little more, so she asked him if there was a problem with letting her loose at bedtime, but Connor said he would do that before sleeping, since he wasn't going to lie down yet, because he didn't need much sleep, and Rose asked if he didn't need much sleep, or couldn't fall asleep. He replied it was both. That explained why he always seemed exhausted. It wasn't bad temper, he just suffered from insomnia. Connor took the opportunity to hand her something, and showed her the teddy bear he had chosen. But Rose didn't like that very much, because as far as she knew, she wasn't a little kid anymore to sleep with a teddy bear. However, when she was about to throw it back at the commander, he said it was a gift from Lila. The little girl wanted to give that as a gift and asked him to choose which would be better, and immediately Rose hugged the toy back. Looking at the teddy bear, she asked Connor to thank the little girl in her place. But going back to the bed dilemma, the commander kept insisting that she sleep, but the girl wasn't the least bit sleepy. And apparently neither was he. After all, who could sleep knowing they would die in 3 days? Not to mention that she could sleep plenty when she was dead. So Connor asked if her big idea was to stay awake for 3 days, and said that if she really couldn't sleep, a good idea would be to hug the teddy bear and start counting sheep, but as if that would work. So Rose went back to the previous question, if he really didn't want to know more about her story. The commander said that he already knew the truth, so she could just be a good girl and simply sleep to leave him in peace. However, Rose held his hand and said firmly that she didn't want to. She wanted to talk until she fell asleep, and she would keep talking even if he didn't want to listen. In the end, the story is different depending on who tells it, and he could be the first person to hear her side of the story. It was his choice whether to believe it or not. After all, he wouldn't believe it anyway, so it made no difference if he listened or not. It was already over now. She had already been condemned. That's why, at the very least, he should listen to her story, and Connor finally seemed convinced of that. It all began when Rose was 15. After all, there was nothing interesting before that. Her own memories were blurry before she turned 15. The most she remembered was always living in the Riorton orphanage, because she hadn't left that place for 15 years. One day, she was being accused of being a thief. Some foolish woman was accusing her of stealing a ring from her room. Her friend tried to calm her down because the manager there didn't like it when things got noisy. But the woman only asked her friend to keep watch and turned her attention to Rose. What irritated her most about the girl was her daring gaze, as if she wasn't important. That got on her nerves. Before leaving and ending the commotion, she told the girl to return the ring as soon as possible and went away. Rose thought that was idiotic. She wasn't the one who had stolen the ring, and honestly didn't understand why that crazy woman had gotten angry with her, since it was Connie who had stolen it. So, looking at the bedroom door open, she had an idea. Since she was already punished anyway, she ended up taking a necklace she saw on top of the nightstand. There was nothing wrong with that. One punishment in exchange for one crime. That world inside the orphanage was all she knew. You had to work regardless of health or age. If not, you'd be beaten with slaps or broomsticks. Life was hard, but she didn't complain, because she thought everyone lived that way. Until one day, she had a glimpse of what life outside the orphanage was like. That happened on a snowy day. She was very busy because she had a pile of clothes to wash, and the river had already frozen at that time. Honestly, it would have been great if the manager had drunk and gone to sleep early. At least she wouldn't get beaten. The only thing she didn't understand was why the streets were so full of people that day. They were talking about some banquet of St. Walburg, and commenting on how the snow had piled up a lot that morning, making the atmosphere very pleasant. But Rose didn't understand what was so impressive about the snow, because now that the river was frozen, they would have more problems in the future. Regardless, what she really wanted to know was what this banquet was. Only much later, when she was older, did she realize that this banquet was an annual night festival, celebrated on the birthday of the greatest witch in history, a night for Walpurgis. Sometimes she thinks about that, how her life would have changed if she hadn't seen the city decorated that day. It probably would have been kind of dull and boring, but she wonders if her life would have been easier that way. If she hadn't had hope, she wouldn't have fallen into despair. On the way back home that same day, the same woman who had scolded her about the ring asked if she knew how long the manager had been looking for her. It was already late, and even so, the girl decided to return only then, but Rose just ignored her. The woman kept shouting until a serene voice interrupted her, and an older woman appeared asking why they were making so much noise in the middle of the night. That was the orphanage manager. And as soon as she laid eyes on Rose and the pile of dirty clothes she was carrying, she called her directly to her room. That day, the girl was beaten. Later, when she returned to her room, she kept wondering what she had seen. Her legs were sore from so much beating, but the only thing that ran through her head was the scene she had witnessed. She didn't know why she had looked inside that house. The people were cheerful and talking, while she was only peeking. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but the situation was very clear. There was no doubt about what was happening there. Even so, she liked to imagine exactly what their mouths were saying. The only information she managed to extract by observing them all was a simple phrase, "I love you." Love was something she had only heard in plays and stories, a strange word that fictional characters spoke day after day. However, that was not the case. That day she saw that this was not an invented word that appeared only in plays and fairy tales. It was something people genuinely said to each other, from parents to children, and even between couples. It was the moment she realized this that her heart broke. How cozy was the phrase, "I love you." The fact was that no one had ever said those words to her, not even once, and that was what made her cry. All she felt was cold, and all she wanted was a place to warm herself, something to keep her safe on cold nights, something to make her feel comforted. But to wish for that in that place was something she thought was reserved only for the weak, because all the other children looked down on those who cried and acted like a baby. That's why she got irritated when she saw other children crying, because crying didn't change anything. But she was wrong, because those children didn't cry out of pain, but out of longing. It wasn't weakness, it was sadness. Unlike her, those children knew what the bright and cozy world looked like. And now that Rose knew it too, she understood how cold and lonely that place was. It was on that day that she realized she was alone and would never hear that phrase, "I love you." Rose lived in a time when witches were still persecuted. During St. Walburg's banquet, everyone placed candles on a cake and made wishes to her, the greatest witch of all time. Rose was no different. Even without a candle or a cake, she wished for the witch to have mercy on her and place in her life anyone who would comfort her with a hug, someone who would genuinely say they loved her. And if that was too much, it would be fine if that person only lied that they loved her, as long as they hugged her. A few days passed after that, and while she was washing dishes, someone came running to call her. When the girl realized, she saw it was one of her fellow orphans who was asking for a plate, and took the chance to comment that Rose seemed very distracted lately, asking if something was wrong. She replied no. Her friend then asked if she was just anxious, since her birthday was coming, because as soon as a girl turned 15, she could no longer stay in the orphanage. Rose asked if that much time had already passed, and her friend said she spoke as if that didn't worry her. And that was exactly the case, because most likely she would be hired as a servant or a concubine, and all the money from her work would go straight into the manager's pocket. Then someone in the back said it would be better to become a concubine, because if she became a servant, she wouldn't be able to leave that life until her death. Another girl appeared and asked if she really thought it was better to be a concubine and live with a husband's bad temper, because she really thought it was better to be a servant and earn money in an honorable way. But interrupting the discussion about which was the worst fate, a little girl entered the room looking for Rose, because the manager was calling her. Someone had gone there to see her. Meanwhile, in the orphanage manager's office, the woman commented to the guest that Rose wouldn't take long to appear. And he was understanding after all. Waiting for a lady was never a problem. He was eager to see her up close. Already, Rose was in her room, wondering if she should put on her best clothes, or even put on makeup, because it wouldn't make sense to get so dressed up if whoever was interested in her only wanted a servant. Honestly, she didn't know what to do. A few minutes later, she appeared in the manager's office. She was well dressed, but not wearing makeup, and was invited to come in. As she went there, she heard the whispers of several girls, commenting that the manager had found her an 80-year-old husband. Some even thought she would just be hired as a servant for some old man. But contrary to what everyone was saying, her fiancé was very different. The manager finally introduced him, Hidley Howards, who approached her, calling her Rose Walker, but quickly corrected himself, because now that she would marry, she would be Rose Howards. That would be her name in the future, but what really impressed the girl was that the man was quite young, even though he was evidently older than her. But he seemed to be a normal person, as much as possible. He asked the manager if she was sure that the girl was healthy, and the woman replied that, as he himself had seen, her medical history was excellent, being 1.60 in height and with perfect vision. She should also be able to have several children, but the man found her very skinny. However, the manager commented that this would be his responsibility, something to take care of in the future because she had already done her part, and her reproductive organs were normal, something guaranteed by Dr. Robinson. Rose was nervous, but this was her chance to get out of there, and in an attempt to make a good impression, she smiled. If that person left, she could end up being sold to a terrible place next time. And in the end, Hidley ended up liking her and decided to believe what the manager said, agreeing to take her. He only needed to sign the paperwork and pay the amount for the girl. Meanwhile, the manager told Rose to wait seated. And finally, the girl managed to feel a little more relieved. She even liked him a little, so she hadn't seen any problem. While the man was signing the papers, he remembered something important and asked to hold her hand. With delicacy, he said he had something to give her. The next moment, he placed a ring on her finger, saying it fit perfectly. He had already bought it beforehand and apparently had a good eye for choosing this kind of accessory. He had already been watching her for a while because he liked her more than the other girls there. And it didn't stop there. Taking something else from his belongings, he showed a teddy bear, asking if she thought it was cute. At that moment, Rose thought that her wish to Wahlberg had come true, and she could fall in love with him. And as soon as the man finished signing the papers, the two went home. Not his house, but their house now. That was the first time she met Hindley Howards, and that was how she became Rose Howards. Arriving at their house, the man began to show her the environment. The first floor was his office, where he worked as a doctor, and the second where they would live. He had already prepared everything she would need, including several makeup accessories. Looking at the girl's admiring eyes, he asked if she felt grateful, and obviously Rose replied yes, hugging him right after. At that moment, she was sincere. She really felt gratitude for him. Unlike the orphanage, she hadn't felt the emptiness in her stomach since she went to live with him, and she didn't tremble anymore with the cold wind. Of course, their moments in bed were painful, but it didn't matter, because that was exactly what she longed for, the warmth of another person. At first, everything was great. He was a gentleman and didn't hit her like the manager and the nannies. But after a few weeks, he began to show who he really was, and the happy life didn't last long. The first time he complained about the food, asking if what was on the table was all she knew how to make. She had served the same dish from the previous morning, but he had never commented about the food before, and the girl replied that they were different dishes because they were seasoned in different ways. But he didn't like the answer because he thought she was trying to argue, even though the girl tried to say that wasn't the case. Pointing his finger at her forehead, Hidley began to complain, since apparently she thought she could do everything perfectly. That was her answer for everything. But from the start, he wondered if there was anything she was capable of doing correctly. Only now he had realized that the girl was useless. And that's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the story. What are you thinking so far? It's incredible how something that seemed like a dream for Rose turned out to be another kind of prison. Do we sometimes search so much for a way out that we don't notice when we're stepping into another trap? What would you do in her place? I really want to know your opinions and theories, so leave them in the comments. And if you want more, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any new ones I post. This work is called Your Eternal Lies, and our recap covered up to chapter 24. Kisses, and see you next time.